Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is episode 11 of Escaping the Moldbug Matrix. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Locals, and Telegram, all of which are in the description box below. Don't forget to, in addition to supporting me on Locals, you can also support me on Buy Me a Coffee and Subscribe Star. As per usual, near the end of the episode, Logos and I will look at the comments. We'll read Super Chats first and other comments as they are relevant or pertain to the conversation. Also, again, for anybody that didn't catch yesterday's stream, this is going to be the last full week of programming until next year. I'm going to be taking some time off for the holidays. But as far as I know, we're still going to be doing the Moldbug Matrix. That's one program we're going to keep going. So, to get that started, Universalism and Original Sin, Mencius Moldbug, July 31st, 2007. I'm traveling today, so I took the liberty of pulling this comment by frequent poster Michael S. up to the front page. If you're curious as to the context, see the Africa audio thread. I suspect that curious condensation in the myth of the noble savage flow from the most central beliefs of universalism. The original theological meaning of universalism was that at the end of days, no one would be damned, everyone would be saved. You know what, Logos? That sounds the exact opposite of a certain religion called Calvinism.
Yeah, well, like we said, he only means hyper-Calvinism in the sense that it's anathema to the centralized Catholic Church. That's it. None of the other theological stuff matters. He's literally just taking a face value version of words.
Right, but then in that case, it doesn't matter because then the cathedral, this top-down centralized power structure he's criticizing, can't be that.
Yeah, I know. That's something else I've been thinking about too. It's like, wait, why are we saying that a bunch of hyper-Calvinists that are anathema to cathedrals and are like hyper-congregationalists are concocting this cathedral that like runs all the information in the world? It doesn't make any sense.
No, I mean, we mentioned this before. That would be congregationalism, but congregationalists aren't in charge either.
Right.
And in fact, with the name of the cathedral, we know exactly who Moldbug is actually pointing the finger at. So why doesn't he just consistently do that? That's the riddle.
Because he's courting authoritarians, and he knows who the authoritarians are.
Yeah, I guess so. This belief was closely associated with early Unitarianism, for example, that of the Socians. Universalism is a way of denying that in Adam's fall we all sinned. If there were no original sin, there is no need for a savior, hence Unitarianism. Well, that's not technically true either, because Unitarianism is just the belief that there's no Trinity. For example, the actual Arians, I don't believe, taught there was no sin. It's just that there was just one God. Just God. You know, I mean, Jews believe in the need for repentance, and they just believe in one God. I mean, this is stupid. You know?
Yeah, it's equivocating on Unitarian. I mean, the only Unitarian I've ever heard of is Universalist Unitarians, who are like hyper the Tao, one belief, all roads lead to salvation kind of people.
Well, he's conflating universalism right here with Unitarianism, and they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
If not by original sin, how then are we to explain the moral failings of humanity? If in a state of nature man is naturally good, the reason must be, as Rousseau suggested, that the institutions of society are to blame. Get rid of them, and a man's inherent goodness will flourish. The concept of the noble savage and of the corrupting influence of civilization is made much easier to accept by our intimate acquaintance with the failings of our own social institutions and our comparable ignorance of those of others. It is easy to see primitive societies as innocent, first because they wish to because the wish is father to the thought, and secondly because we don't know that much about them. Universalism inverts the thesis of Bishop Reginald Heber's famous hymn from Greenland's icy mountains. In Heber's lyrics, the lands of the heathen are described as places where every prospect pleases and only man is vile, because ignorance of Christ's promise to redeem vile men from the original sin that is their portion as heirs to Adam's fall. But since according to the Universalist view, man is not inherently vile, it is amongst civilized people that every prospect pleases and only man is vile because of the perverting influence of civilization. Therefore, we have a better chance of finding the good amongst peoples who have never been tainted by its poison breath. The degree to which this view has persisted since the time of Rousseau, despite all the evidence to the contrary, shows the depths of the Universalist faith. The French Revolution alone should have shown Rousseau's theory that sweeping away the old corrupt institutions would inaugurate a return to the Edenic state was a fraud. Still, the same sort of people who pinned their hopes on the Jacobins later pinned them on the Bolsheviks and on Mao Zedong, and they still think Castro's Cuba as a promising experiment, if not a proved one. Michael Moore. Anthropology is merely another venue for such hopes. Consider how Margaret Mead's Samoa or the gentle Tassidae or other false and romantic interpretations of the primitive. Even primitive zoology does not escape this. For a long time, chimpanzees were assured shared more DNA with humans than any other species. To be sure, baby chimps are cute and affectionate, but it did not long escape the notice that adult ones shared, in addition to DNA, all too human tendencies toward territoriality, greed, and violence. Then the primatologists discovered bonobo apes who were supposedly bisexual and had a communal economy. It takes a village and matriarchal social organization. What could more ideally answer Universalist fondest hopes? Unfortunately for them, this myth too is beginning to crumble. See the most recent July 30th issue of the New Yorker. Whatever may be said about some of the beliefs of Orthodox Christianity, it seems to me that there is a deep insight into the human character in the doctrine of original sin. Pride, anger, avarice, envy, sloth, gluttony, and lust are fundamental and dominant aspects of human nature. Semp et ubiquite et ab omnibus. They are innate because they are all, in one way or other, assertions of self-interest. Consider the squalling infant who is too young to be sensible to any moral instruction. He thinks only of his own comfort and never mind his mama or papa's inconvenience. He wants it now. The infant displays 6 of the 7 deadly sins. Lust alone fails to appear until the onset of puberty. All the character traits that we admire, such as kindness, honesty, and generosity, by contrast, are not instinctual in this way. They have to be learnt. It is, among others, the job of civilization to teach them. And that point is one that Universalism fails to acknowledge. It may be the germ of its destruction. So, a couple points here. I would agree with Moldbug that the Rousseauian view is garbage. That man is okay. There's a middle point I want to take here, right? Because we have a sort of like reactionary position that man is awful and we need to have like a good state to reform the man, and that somehow the state being composed of awful men doesn't get corrupted itself. Don't ask that question. And then Rousseau's like, no, men are great. The state's bad. But if the state's made of men, that doesn't make sense. But if we get rid of the state, men are still awful. There's this like middle position where we don't really see much in this conversation. One, that man has awful tendencies. But two, that different systems can accentuate or mitigate those tendencies. And so, the sensible position is to have systems in place, institutions in place that mitigate against the worst excesses. Not that they could be either completely eliminated or that man could be perfected. But that sort of middle ground doesn't really seem to make it to the public discourse now, does it, Logos?
No, and it should. I mean, if nothing else, if we're going to ignore the metaphysics at least, let's be Hobbesians about it. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, and the other thing too is what was the other one here? Yeah, this is a strange a strange way to treat an infant. Funnily enough, this is the side of rhetoric that you can actually hear from Calvinists. So like people like Doug Wilson and other big Calvinist speakers will speak in these terms about infants and children. Partly because I think it comes from Augustine and his Confessions. But I think this is entirely unfair. I mean, they're unconscious. What are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to speak in a nice British accent? Excuse me, I've soiled my diaper. Can you change it for me? Like, well, what do you expect an infant to do?
Well, there's always the question of intent and innocence and all that, right? Like, if they couldn't have done better, if they don't know better, is it truly a sin? Or is it a bad action done in an innocent state? Like, I don't know, let's suppose a child was tricked into doing something wrong because they just didn't know any better. I mean, that's another example we could talk about. Like, it all seems the same thing to me.
Well, yeah, guilt implies intent, and as long as there's no intent, there's no guilt. So, I mean, this is just an obvious rule of law. That's why insane people get different penalties for the same crime that a person with all possession of his faculties would. This should be obvious, but a lot of things with Moldbug should be obvious.
To be fair, this isn't even Moldbug. This is one of his commenters.
That's true. That's true. What's wrong with CS research? August the 1st, 2007. The other day, I was glaring obsessively at my sad, dwindling traffic numbers, and I noticed that a couple of weeks ago, someone seems to have sent my post on the decline and fall of the American university system to Reddit Thought Programming, where it got, I thought quite amusingly, 46 upvotes and 36 downvotes. Obviously, UR is not a programming blog. And in a post that warms up with a 75-mile-long block quote about Hegel, I didn't really think of myself as writing for a technical audience. Technical audiences are not to be underrated, however, and I've noticed that a lot of UR readers are in this category. So I thought I'd say a few more words about CS research. That is not a subject that interests all, and if it doesn't interest you, no one can conceivably require you to read about it, and I recommend you just skip the post. Well, Logos, I think that's our cue. What do you think?
Sure.
I don't. It's just about computer science, and I'll take Moldbug's word for it. I'll move on.
Yep.
The country that used to exist, August 3rd, 2007. What the heck is history anyway? History is just a bunch of stuff that happened, mostly to people now dead. We owe these people nothing. They're dead. After all, sometimes we have some scraps of paper they scribbled on. Sometimes we don't. I was reading Tacitus's Annals the other week, not for any good reason. I was just somewhere where there was a copy of Tacitus. Like, oh, Logos, where would you be where there's just a copy of Tacitus lying down? What are you talking about?
Yeah, right.
Like, oh yeah, hey, we're just in the lobby, waiting for a dentist appointment. Here's Tacitus's Annals for you. Go ahead and read that for some light reading while the dentist is delayed. It's like, whatever. And I was rather looking forward to the story of Caligula, who Tacitus quite confusingly calls Caius Caesar, as if there was some shortage of Romans by this name. Suddenly, though, there was a gap. Tacitus did write about Caligula, but no one knows what he said. The book of the Annals is lost. We have most of the Annals, though, including the opening, and here it goes. Rome at the beginning was ruled by kings. Freedom and the consulship were established by Lucius Brutus. Dictatorships were held for a temporary crisis. The power of the decemvirs did not last beyond 2 years, nor was the consular jurisdiction of the military tribunes of long duration. The despotism of Cinna and Sulla were brief. The rule of Pompeius and Crassus soon yielded before Caesar. The arm of Lepidus and Antonius before Augustus, who, when the world was wearied by civil strife, subjected it to the empire under the title of prince. But the successes and reverses of the old Roman people have been recorded by famous historians, and fine intellects were not wanting to describe the times of Augustus, till growing sycophancy scared them away. The histories of Tiberius, Caius, Claudius, and Nero, while they were in power, were falsified through error, and after their death were written under the irritation of a recent hatred. Hence, my purpose is to relate a few facts about Augustus, more particularly his last acts than the reign of Tiberius, and all which follows without either bitterness or partiality from any motives to which I am far removed. Without either bitterness or partiality, Sinat era et studio. I doubt these words were idly chosen, and we kids these days could do a lot worse than to imitate them. No one gives a rat's ass about Tiberius now, but no shortage of either ira or studio. Anyway, it's not too hard to lose a book of Tacitus, nor is it any great tragedy. They actually made a documentary about Caligula, so obviously we know something. It's slightly more difficult to lose a country. It happened, though, and it was not Dalmatia or Dacia or Raetia or Bithynia. Here's a picture of it. The country was called Rhodesia, and it's no longer found on any map, Earth's crust being relatively stable. The place where it was still exists, but you wouldn't want to go there. The story of Rhodesia is a strange category we might call living history. Rhodesia is dead, but there are still a few Rhodesians kicking around, and some of them have blogs, such as this fellow, whose opinions I'm sure many UR readers might contest. Because that innocuous little motto, sin ira et studio, acquires a slight edge When we come to the living history category, when Tacitus wrote about, say, Vespasian, he was writing of events of a roughly similar age. You can be sure there was plenty of both ira and studio. History is not a list of facts. We all agree in 1973, when I was born, nowhere near Rhodesia. I have no personal connection at all to the place. There was a country by that name. In 2007, as I write, there is not. These are facts, but they are not history. If Tacitus had merely compiled a list of facts, no one would have copied his books, and we would never have heard of any Tacitus. The genius of Tacitus and his classical peers, Thucydides, for example, is even more readable, is that they actually tell us what happened, not just the facts but the story. And perhaps we have no choice but to believe them, but we do. Their voices are credible. So what the heck happened to Rhodesia? Why was there a Rhodesia, and why isn't there Rhodesia anymore? What's the story? It's a rather large question. It involves the lives of millions of people. It's not quite as large a question as what the heck happened to the Roman Empire, but at least no one involved in the fall of the Roman Empire is still alive and liable to send me any angry email. Before we try to answer this question, you might enjoy a few minutes immersing yourself in Rhodesia memorabilia, large piles of which can be found here at rhodesia.nl. For example, this is quite a typical story. This and this more cerebral, and this more lurid, represent the Rhodesian Ministry of Information's view of the conflict. Rhodesia, after its unilateral declaration of independence in 1965, became quite isolated from the Western world. And as a result, even the graphic design of Rhodesian publications can strike us as quite unusual. See, for example, this large PDF, which is the final issue of Cheetah, the magazine of the Rhodesian Light Infantry. If you are willing to take a minute from this 8 megabyte download, perhaps you will see why I find the story of Rhodesia so fascinating. It is simply an introduction to an alien world. It might as well have been printed on Alpha Centauri, except that it seems to be in English. Aside from the language barrier, I'm quite sure I have more in common with Tacitus himself than any of the odd bipeds who adorn the pages of Cheetah. Perhaps a modern German has a rather the same reaction to documents from the Third Reich. The last 2 pages of the PDF, which are quite artistic, may be the most unusual. Don't dismiss the selection of past Cheetah covers. Of course, this does nothing to answer the question. Perhaps first we should get the official story, which we can hear from our good old friend Samantha Power. As Power wrote in an excellent 2003 article called How to Kill a Country, although Zimbabwe is as broken as any country on the planet, it offers a testament not to some inherent African inability to govern, but to a minority rule as oppressive and inconsiderate of welfare of citizens as its ignominious white predecessor. I suspect the readers of Cheetah might take some issue with the word ignominious, but of course the winners write the history books, or at least they got to teach at Harvard, and the losers are well losers. In any case, Power is no fan of ZANU-PF, and she closes with the same point. For all their differences, Mugabe and Ian Smith share a basic misconception about power. They both fail to realize that a government cannot survive indefinitely when it advances the political and economic desires of a few at the expense of the many. When I asked Smith whether he would stop leaving his front door open now that starving Zimbabweans were prowling the city, he replied, "I'm not going to change now." The same, alas, is most likely true of Robert Mugabe. See this, how bad Robert Mugabe is? He is just as bad as Ian Smith, who almost unbelievably is still alive, though shortly. This was written as of 2007, so of course Ian Smith is dead now. Though shortly after this article was published, Smith's home was stolen and he moved, like so many of his compatriots, to South Africa, which presumably will survive long enough for him to at least die of old age in his own bed. You can buy Ian Smith's memoirs here. Be warned, he's not a very good writer. Of course, the idea that starving Rhodesians, whatever their skin tone, were ever prowling Salisbury is rather surprising and quite untrue. As the Rhodesian government put it in 1979, bear in mind that the Rhodesian dollar was pegged 1-to-1 to the US dollar. As the United States Department Agency reports that in the decade 1965 to 1975, Rhodesian economic growth outstripped that of almost all its neighbors. Her gross national product rose by almost 80%, and the per capita income by 26%. The 1974 per capita income of $422 compared very favorably with that of $348 in Botswana, $148 in Zaire, and $126 in Tanzania. In the purely material sphere, earnings have increased phenomenally. In 1958, the 652,000 workers in the industrial sector earned an average per capita income of $169, ranging from a high of $285 in the finance and insurance fields to a low of $104 for agricultural worker. In the 1965, the figures were $652 656,000 workers, average income $250, and by 1975, 982,000 workers who had a mean per capita income of $692. With these employed in the educational, transport and communications, and finance and insurance and real estate spheres, earning an average of $981, while the least paid employees, agricultural workers, domestic servants, and miners, quarry workers, earn $336 on the average. The black private enterprises growing particularly in the fields of transport, distribution, and agriculture. Black business owners manage highly successful businesses which provide transport between the urban areas and the tribal trust lands. Black retailers own and run about 2,500 stores, varying in size and sophistication, and blacks own and manage about 8,000 commercial farms. In the professional field, there are many successful black doctors, lawyers, teachers, accountants, etc. In the private sector of business and commerce, there are significant examples of appropriate responsibilities offered to and successfully discharged by qualified blacks, and many large companies employ blacks in management or trainee management positions. The civil service employs increasing numbers of blacks in established posts, especially in the fields of education, health, and social welfare. I know it seems odd, and I do not have any link handy, but one of the mainstays of the early post-war case for decolonization was actually that European government was artificially retarding the development of Black Africa, confining native populations to traditional pre-industrial economic, social, and political structures, and preventing them from moving forward to a modern, centrally planned socialist economy. Hopefully, if you are a regular UR reader, I have established some credibility, and you are willing to take me on trust when I say that people actually believe this. Otherwise, I'll have to dig up a link or something. Of course, this proposition is no longer uttered as such, but it no longer needs to be uttered because so few remember Africa before decolonization, and those who don't exactly teach at Harvard, and so it has passed into history and fossilized in a way. It can be assumed and included in arguments without any actual thought. In fact, what power really means is that a government cannot survive indefinitely if it defies the wishes of the international community, i.e. of world power. Here we have the ultimate cause of Rhodesia's destruction. I believe this is a clear and undisputed fact. The proximate cause of Rhodesia's demise is also clear. Rhodesia was throttled by carnations, stabbed in the back by South Africa, and finished off by Jimmy Carter. Now, for those who don't know, I think the reason why Moldbug uses the term carnations here is in, look this up, it was 73, 74. 1974, there was a revolution against the dictator of Portugal by basically progressive elements of the military. And the dictator at the time, Salazar, had been pro-Rhodesia. So he's referring to the Carnation Revolution. The Carnations were dropped into rifles and used to overthrow the Estado Novo of Portugal, which then abandoned Mozambique, Portuguese territory, for the last 500 years, which in 1975 reverted to the international community, specifically its Cyrillic arm. The Carnation Revolution left South Africa as the last ally of a landlocked, blockaded Rhodesia. As everyone in the world can surely now agree, the National Party regime in South Africa were swine, and they thought they could appease the international community by selling out the Rhodesians, for example, cutting off their fuel supply. While this did them no good at all, it essentially forced the Rhodesian government to surrender. As this article describes, Henry Kissinger approved, or at least led the Rhodesians to believe he'd approved, a plan under which Rhodesia would adopt a universal suffrage voting system. Rhodesia, unlike South Africa, never had any apartheid system or race-specific elections. The entire cause of the dispute was that the Rhodesian electoral system followed Cecil Rhodes' dictum of equal rights for all civilized men, had a property qualification for elections. However, the first plan for a majority rule was designed to elect the moderate black leader Abel Muzawarwa. It was boycotted by the guerrilla leaders Mugabe and Nkomo, and worst of all, specifically preserved the white Rhodesian civil service. In other words, at least for the time being, it was essentially cosmetic. Carter and his advisors on African affairs, Andrew Young, refused to accept the results of Kissinger's diplomacy and forced a new election, which was won quite violently by Mugabe. Of course, presumably Young would disagree with this perception, as one Rhodesian Ministry of Information pamphlet put it. This weekend, in the worst atrocity committed against white civilians in the history of Rhodesia's 6-year war, terrorists of Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe National Liberation Army hacked and battered to death almost the entire white staff and families at the LM Pentecostal mission in the eastern border mountains. Mr. Young is asked, Does Mr. Mugabe strike you as a violent man? He replies, not at all. He's a very gentle man. In fact, one of the ironies of the whole struggle is that I can't imagine Joshua Nkomo or Robert Mugabe ever pulling the trigger on a gun to kill anyone. I doubt they ever have. The violent people are Smith's people, and hopefully won't be around for the new Zimbabwe. This weekend, when local and international journalists arrived at the scene of the massacre 15 kilometers from Umtali and less than 7 kilometers from Mozambique border, the mutilated and blood-stained bodies of 3 men, 4 women, and 5 children, including a 3-week-old baby, were lying as they had been found that morning. Mr. Young is asked how he gets on with Mr. Mugabe. He replies, I find that I am fascinated by his intelligence, by his dedication. The only thing that frustrates me about Robert Mugabe is that he is so damned incorruptible. The problem is he was educated by Jesuits, and when you get the combination of a Jesuit and a Marxist kind of philosophy merging in one person, you've got a heck of a guy to deal with. So we have the ultimate cause and proximate cause, but do we really know the story? All these facts are easy to assemble into the Rhodesian point of view. From this perspective, what happened is that Rhodesia, a white British nation which extended the benefits of peace, law, and economic dependence to the Shona and Matabele nations, which shared its idyllic little corner of the Dark Continent, was smashed by international pinko communism, which destroyed the country by handing it over to the vicious terrorist gangs its soldiers had been bravely resisting. The subsequent debacle of Mugabe's Zimbabwe was as predictable as it was tragic, and if God-fearing and American and British citizens have subscribed to Cheetah and read more of these Ministry of Information pamphlets, the whole thing could have been avoided. Do I believe this? Well, in a certain sense, I believe it. I certainly think it's a perspective that is worth appreciating, albeit in a slightly less caricatured terms, as long as you know the official story. I definitely pay good money to see Samantha Power debate the last of the Rhodesians on the subject. However, I don't think either of these narratives is quite how Tacitus put it, and nor is the combination truly era et studio completely satisfying. Okay, so before he goes on, I will say this is one of the few times where I'm in substantial agreement with Moldbug. I've studied the history of Rhodesia pretty extensively in its struggles against communism over the last 15 years, and that's more or less what happened. I mean, for completely, irrational reasons, they were sold out to the communists. And Mugabe was only toppled recently, like a year or two ago. So the legacy of that disaster was pretty bad. Now, this was mostly history, Logos. Is there anything that you want to add to this, though, before I keep reading?
Nope, not a thing.
Okay. Okay. How? Perhaps if there was any unifying thread of the story, it is in the life of Garfield Todd, eulogized by the Grouniad here and described from a liberal Rhodesian perspective here. Because there was such a thing as a liberal Rhodesian perspective. Rhodesia was a country, not a cartoon, and it had politics of its own. And these politics, I think, are relevant to more than Rhodesia, which, after all, is dead. They are a kind of microcosm of post-war Anglosphere politics as a whole, in which each faction had its strange Rhodesian reflection. Todd basically was the universalist to end all universalists. He was not just a crypto-Christian, he was a Christian, a representative of the powerful missionary system. He devoted himself with typical universalist noblesse oblige to the uplift and education of Africans. And he was, in fact, Robert Mugabe's boss. Mugabe got his start as a school teacher in the Daida, New Zealand Churches of Christ Mission School, where Todd was the principal. Small wonder that in 1972, Todd, the former PM of Rhodesia, was confined under house arrest for having worked underground to support Mugabe's guerrillas. His daughter, Judith Todd, among the other efforts, underwent a hunger strike against Smith's government, recently revealed that during the 1983 Matabele massacre, in which tens of thousands of Mugabe's tribal opponents were murdered, she was raped by the officers of the ZANU's North Korean trained security forces. At the time, her father was senator of Zimbabwe, appointed by his former protege Mugabe, whose position he had done so much to obtain only 3 years previously, and Garfield Todd remained in this role for 2 more years. What would Tacitus make of this? Frankly, I'm not sure he could even process it. The whole affair is not just in his philosophy. Wittgenstein said that if a lion could talk, we would not understand him. Probably Garfield Todd, simply by virtue of being born in 1908, had some Latin, but I'm not sure Tacitus would find him any more intelligible than Wittgenstein's lion. The social relationship between Todd and Smith is particularly fascinating. Travelers to Rhodesia in its later years often remarked that it seemed like a piece of pre-war Britain, even 19th century Britain, that had somehow fossilized and failed to develop. A figure like Ian Smith could never have achieved any political prominence in pre-war Britain because his origins were decidedly middle class. Smith was an RAF officer in World War II, but his accent was no doubt anything but old Etonian. Much as Todd was the ultimate missionary, Smith was the ultimate settler. In the battle between missionaries and settlers, which ended, of course, in the victory of the former, was the great conflict of colonialism. Rhodesia can be seen as a sort of British alternative present. Perhaps something like a Rhodesian Britain could have existed in Europe, or World War II never happened, and the middle-class right-wing movements were not considered populist and intrinsically dangerous. Today's British National Party, for example, is very reminiscent of the Rhodesian Front in its general cultural associations. Note that, like the Rhodesian sites I've linked to, the BNP also has the worst possible taste in web design. This is a very petite bourgeoisie. One thing I want to add here is I think the reason why Rhodesia developed the way it did and Britain didn't is because Rhodesia has a lot in common with the state of Israel, right? If you're living in constant fear of existential annihilation, your entire country is going to have a very much different attitude. And this is something that you've mentioned before, Logos, privately with Veblen, the idea of the military versus corporations and how they're going to have, without a military, your state dies, but without corporations, you can't innovate new weapon systems. And there's going to be external pressures that mitigate which way you go. Well, Rhodesia wasn't an island, so they had to go in favor of the military. And that creates a certain set of cultural conditions that Britain as an island could avoid. Would you agree with that, Logos?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Smith's Rhodesian Front was profoundly optimate Vicia concoction, basically lower middle class with a light spattering of degenerate aristocrats. Given the BDHOV conflict that Smith's Rhodesia would fight a war with the Universalist world community or with the likes of Uber Universalist Garfield Todd is utterly unsurprising. Remember that this is not just a political conflict, but a religious war. Universalism and traditionalist revelationism are the two leading clades of Christianity in the world today. If revelationism had any chance of extirpating universalism, it would surely seize it. So one can't really be too shocked and offended that the project is proceeding in the opposite direction. The United States is the only country in which any political force with even the slightest resemblance to the Rhodesian Front is tolerated as a legitimate party. For all of Europe and Britain, the analogy to National Socialism, which of course was another Vicia party, is simply too close to home. Today's Europeans simply cannot understand why Republicans, at least populist Republicans, are allowed to exist within the American political system. They look at it rather the way you look at someone who kept a pet leopard in his closet. Fortunately for Universalists, the political wind is certainly in their sails. It's increasingly difficult for populist Republicans to survive in the American political climate simply because the press they get is so bad. The likes of Tom Tancredo, and Duncan Hunter could never get themselves appointed as first-tier presidential candidates, whereas John McCain, Mitt Romney, and Rudolph Giuliani, all of whom have proved themselves acceptable to the Universalist press, can. Even George W. Bush out-descended the field on the basis of his compassionate conservatism. And as some commentators have observed, neoconservatism itself contains a powerful dose of universalism. Until a new outbreak of middle American populism creates a new McCarthy or Reagan, the Republicans are headed back towards post-partisan territory, and where, like Wilkie, Eisenhower, or Rockefeller, they will again serve the Polygon's faithful lapdogs, deeply sorry they ever thought of digging a hole in the sofa. Well, it looks like, at least as of 2016, the populists found their McCarthy. But, I don't know, Logos. Do you think the populist genie's out of the bottle?
Yes. Definitely.
All right. In other words, my predictions for the future: more progress. There is only one slight problem with the picture. The problem is that basically Ian Smith and his cronies were right, and basically Garfield Todd and his friends were wrong. Universalist Christianity is profoundly adaptive when it comes to outcompeting its opponents. It's very difficult for a Christian to argue against universalism because it is manifestly so pure and Christ-like. That's so bogus. I mean, no, Christians don't believe everyone's saved. This is stupid. It's the easiest thing in the world for a Christian to argue against. I mean, is there anything you want to say to this, Logos?
No.
Whatever. Even in a time and a place like Rhodesia in the 60s, when universalism was blatantly suicidal, it was by no means easy for Smith's insurgent party to brush the establishment aside. The Rhodesian Front could win the votes of Rhodesian farmers who didn't want to be murdered in their beds. It had no chance of convincing the world. However, universalism also has its enemies. Smith never really managed to hate the likes of Todd. He thought they were misguided. I was brought up a universalist, so obviously I have the same feeling. It was not Smith but Mugabe who proved the real enemy of the Todds. And being an enemy, he saw no shame at all in feigning Christian sentiments to manipulate his enemies. This is the permanent strategy of the militarist kleptocracies against the universalist democracies. Negotiate with us. We are really moderate. We would not hurt a fly. True, we are armed to the teeth, but we only care about social justice. All we want is our rights. We, in fact, are budding universalists, and if you call off your dogs, disband your commandos, and accept our just and reasonable demands, we too will turn the other cheek. If you are any sort of Christian, this song cannot fail to charm your heart a little, and all the more if you are a universalist, which after all is a very fanatical sort of a Christian. A universalist by definition believes that the world is progressing toward a future in which everyone will be a universalist. When he sees evidence of this, he wants to believe it. When I think about universalist support for third world liberation movements, hardly a single one of which turned out to be anything but evil and corrupt, and certainly none of which came even close to providing better government than its colonial predecessors, of course, it's easy for me rejecting universalism to sneer. But this is just evidence of the same mentality. Imagine if, say, the Congo or Saudi Arabia or Samoa was taken over tomorrow by a movement which claimed to be a libertarian, possibly even by the formalist corporate capitalist state of my dreams. I have trouble imagining this, of course, but if it did, presumably my first inclination would be to support it. And presumably I'd have a bit of trouble realizing that these acolytes of my preferred future were in fact a gang of killers and thieves. When we read history, sign era at studio, we cannot hate the Garfield Todds. We can describe them as stupid, hubristic, fanatical, and destructive, of course. And so, of course, they were, at least in my opinion, but any effort to rid human society of stupidity, hubris, and fanaticism or destructiveness is itself so hubristic that it simply rebounds the mistake. But wait, Logos, wasn't the whole point of formalism to avoid human stupidity and fanaticism?
Yes.
I mean, Logos, does this guy even think before he says anything?
Has he ever?
I guess that's true. If certain people had thought clearly and acted effectively, perhaps Rhodesia would have survived. They didn't, and it didn't. The only lesson we can draw from this is that it's important to think clearly and act effectively. The past is dead. We owe it nothing. You know, that's a very modernist, dare I say, universalist thing to say, Logos. I don't think people that value the past or, the true justice would say that.
Nope.
James Burnham's Dante, Politics as a Wish. August 6th, 2007. Feeling momentarily short of inspiration, I thought I'd type in what I think is one of the greatest political essays ever written. James Burnham's Dante, Politics as a Wish. This essay opens his Machiavellian's 1943, which will currently set you back $67 for a used pocketbook. It's worth it. If you have reactions to Dante, Politics as a Wish, please post them as usual, writing as if I, not Burnham, were the author. I will try to answer on his behalf. The formal meaning of de monarchia. In the 1932 platform of the Democratic Party, we may read the following. Believing that a party platform is a covenant with the people to be faithfully kept by the party when entrusted with power, and that the peoples are entitled to know in plain words the terms of the contract to which they are asked to subscribe, we hereby declare this to be the platform of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party solemnly promises by appropriate action to put into effect the principles, policies, reforms herein advocated, and to eradicate the policies, methods, and practices herein condemned. We advocate an immediate and drastic reduction of governmental expenditures by abolishing useless commissions, offices, consolidating departments and bureaus, and eliminating extravagance to accomplish a savings of not less than 25% in the cost of the federal government. Maintenance of the national credit by a federal budget annually balanced on the basis of accurate executive estimates within revenues. 3, a sound currency to be preserved at all hazards. We condemn. 4, the open and covert resistance of administrative office officials to every effort made by the congressional committees to control the extravagant expenditures of the government. 5, the extravagance of the Farm Board, its disastrous action which made the government a speculator in farm products. To accomplish these purposes and to recover economic liberty, we pledge the nominees of this convention. That the nominees upheld this pledge was made clear by the candidate for the presidency on July 2nd, 1932, when he spoke in a public acceptance of his nomination. As an immediate program of action, we must abolish useless offices. We must eliminate actual perfunctions of government functions. in fact, that we are not definitely essential to the continuance of government. We must merge, we must consolidate functions of government and let the private citizen give up luxuries which we can no longer afford. I propose to you, my friends, and through you, that the government of all kinds, big and little, be made solvent, and that the example be set by the President of the United States and his cabinet. He returned to these themes frequently throughout his campaign. In a radio address delivered July 30th, 1932, for example, he summed up, any government, like any family, can for a year spend a little more than it earns. But you and I know that a continuation of that habit means the poorhouse. First of all, Logos, obviously this is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Could you imagine a Democrat saying that today?
No.
You can't spend more than you earn in a year? Wow. Well, we've come a long way, haven't we? What are we to make of the words in these several quotations? They would be easy enough to explain if we could assume that the men who wrote them were just liars, deliberately trying to deceive the people. There is, however, no convincing evidence that would permit us to draw so cynical a conclusion. Are we to believe then that they were utterly stupid, with no understanding of economics or politics or what was going on in the world? Taking the words as they stand, they would seem to be the only alternative conclusion, but this also does not seem very plausible. These men and their associates, though they doubtless knew less than everything, and less than they thought they knew, were surely not so ignorant as to have believed literally that the words seemed to indicate. There was some further puzzle here. Perhaps the words do not really have anything to do with cheap government and sound currency and a balanced budget and the rest of what appears to be their subject matter. We are asking questions about the meaning of words men use in connection with political and social affairs in order to avoid bias from partisan feelings of the moment and to seek a greater generality in the answer. I shall briefly examine the same questions as they arise from words written more than 6 centuries ago. So that's the first break. Anything you want to say so far, Logos?
Wrong button. Not yet. Let's see where he goes with this.
Okay. Dante Alighieri, besides the most wonderful poem ever written, finished only one other major work. This was a treatise on politics, which he called De Monarchia, a title that may be translated as On the Empire. De Monarchia is divided into 3 books, each of the 3 subdivided into numerous chapters. The general subject stated by Dante is the knowledge of the temporal monarchy, which is called empire, by which is meant a unique princedom extending over all persons in time. The topics of the 3 books are explained as follows. In the first place, we may inquire and examine whether the unique empire, is needful for the well-being of the world. In the second, whether the Roman people rightfully assume to itself the function of monarchy. And in the third, whether the authority of the monarchy depends immediately upon God or some other minister or vicar of God. The empire Dante had concretely in mind is the Holy Roman Empire of medieval times, which he mistakenly believed to be the continuation of the ancient Roman Empire. In answer to his 3 main inquiries, he maintains first that mankind should be governed by a single empire or state. Second, that the sovereignty is properly exercised by the Holy Roman Emperor, conceived as the continuator of the ancient Roman Empire. And third, that the temporal and political authority exercised by the emperor is independent of the authority of the Pope and the Church. As Dante puts it, depends immediately on God. To establish this first point, that there should be a single unified world state, that the world that Dante had in mind was, of course, Europe and the littoral of the Mediterranean, but no such restriction is made in his arguments, and his reasoning applies as well, or as ill, to the entire world as to the world he knew. Dante begins by stating certain first principles which he believes are the necessary foundation for all political reasoning. The ultimate goal for all mankind is the full development of man's potentialities, which means, in the last analysis, eternal salvation and the vision of God. The aim of temporal civilization is to provide the conditions for achieving this ultimate goal, chief among which is universal peace. A variety of subtle arguments, distinctions, and analogies show that this condition, and in general the organization of the collective life of all mankind, in such a way as to permit the reaching of the ultimate goal, can only be carried out through the unity of direction. God, moreover, is the supreme unity, and it being his intention that mankind should resemble him as much as possible, this can be done only when mankind is also unified under a single ruler. The motion of the heavens is regulated by the simple, uniform motion of the outermost sphere, the primum mobile, and man should strive to imitate the heavens. Only a unified political administration can check tyrannical governments and thus give man freedom. can guard the freedom of others by itself, by being itself wholly free, can guarantee concord and harmony, which always presupposes unity. These arguments, which prove that there should be a single unified political administration of all mankind, led by a single ruler, are historically substantiated by the fact that the incarnation of Christ took place under the temporal ruler of Emperor Augustus. So, okay, assuming that Moldbug is giving us a faithful reproduction of the position of Dante, which I'm inclined to believe that it is. This is quite a common argument. I mean, we've seen this a lot from the trads, but also if you look at like the actual history of the Middle Ages, that's one of the claims. The idea was it's the occult principle of as above, so below. So if God is the universal ruler in heaven, there should be a universal ruler on earth which imitates him, and that's sort of the justification for the Eastern Roman Empire, for the Holy Roman Empire. And, you know, from a Christian point of view, this is utterly specious because the argument that there is a earthly representation of the divine power is correct. But if you read the writings in the New Testament, it's not an emperor who has this power. It's the husband. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul says that the husband stands in relationship to his wife and presumably his children as the way church stands to Christ. So it's not the emperor that represents this God on earth. It's or that kingly authority on earth. It's the husband. And of course, what ends up happening is that the emperor then subverts that because the emperor can, you know, take your property, take your women, take whatever he wants, and then leads to all the other tragedies. The other thing I'd say, writing when he did, you know, Dante already saw the fall. Well, he didn't see, but the fall of the Western Roman Empire had already happened. And at that point, the Western Roman Empire was nominally Catholic. So it clearly doesn't avoid the things that he says it does. Now, I think we could probably argue Dante speaking in sort of abstract, ideal terms, but I think a lot of it ends up being question begging because, of course, order and harmony, in fact, can be very, you know, can be difficult to maintain at the expense of the imperial state because the imperial state is constantly, well, for example, constantly raising taxes. Right, one of the things we've talked about, Logos, is that yeah, international trade routes exist under imperiums, but then you have to constantly raise taxes to pay for the security to keep the trade routes open, and there's eventually a point at which the lines cross and it's no longer profitable, which leads to a decline of the empires. So do you have anything you want to say on that portion of us?
Yeah, one thing I found kind of interesting about the argument was when he said, only a unified political administration can check tyrannical governments and thus give men freedom. It's like, well, okay, well, what if the unified administration becomes tyrannical? Who's going to check that?
Well, just like Catholics and the Pope, we don't ask that question.
Clearly not.
We don't ask that question. How dare you? Oh, man. In the second book, Dante considers and accepts the claim of the Roman people to the seat of the Universal Empire. It is justified by their nobility derived from the descent from the Trojan Aeneas and by numerous miracles which God worked to give witness to the claim. The Roman public spirit showed that they were aiming at the right and thus must have had right on their side. Furthermore, the legitimacy of their claim was proved by the fact that the Romans had the effective faculty of ruling, the power to rule, whereas all other peoples failed in effective rule, as is noted in scriptures and other sacred writings. Finally, the sacrifice of Christ would not have been valid in erasing the stain of original sin from all mankind unless Pilate, as a representative of Rome, had valid authority to pronounce judicial sentence upon all mankind. But hold on, if you're going to appeal to Pilate, that undercuts the point that you just pointed out, Logos. Because, you know, if only we have one guy in charge to make sure that justice is done. But, you know, no, but if you have to appeal to Pilate to make this, you've undercut your entire argument because all Christians are going to admit, they have to admit that Pilate was acting unjustly.
Yeah, he washed his hands of the situation. The people were acting tyrannical against Christ. Pilate was the one that could have done something about it as a representative of the Roman Empire, and he washed his hands of the situation. So just because you have a central authority, even if it doesn't become tyrannical, there's no guarantee that it's going to do the job of maintaining, of thwarting tyranny regionally.
Oh man, not only that. I mean, we're gonna have to use the D word here, Logos. Pilate was demotic. You know, he was letting the mob tell him what to do. I mean,
Yep.
I thought the whole point of monarchy was to avoid that.
Yeah, I mean that's democracy. What are we talking about?
I don't know, like that. I think formerly in that situation that the mob had power, not Pilate. Yeah, I think. Now again, I haven't read On Monarchy, so I'm just assuming Moldbug is giving a correct account of his arguments. Book one, I think, is that makes sense. I'll go with it. Now I have read the Divine Comedy twice, and Dante does like the Trojans and Aeneas and the Romans, so this early part could be true as an argument that he makes. But the other thing is here, all other peoples failed in effective rule. This is weird, right? Because when he's writing this, there's this thing called the Byzantine Empire. Well, we call it that, but they called themselves the Roman Empire. I mean, they were the Romans in the Middle Ages, and they would have made exactly the same claim. So now we have a problem of two people making the same claim in this fashion. How do we resolve it, Logos?
Well, not only that, I mean, let's just use basic induction. If everybody who's tried to make an empire has failed, why don't we take that as a Morian shift against the first argument and say maybe an empire is just not a good idea, instead of saying, you know what, it might actually work this time?
Yeah, you know what that sounds like? It almost sounds like the communist,
That's exactly what I was thinking.
No real communisms. Oh, so no real monarchy's been tried yet, huh? Is that it?
Yeah, no true Roman Empire has existed.
That's amazing. All right, book three. Book three discusses the ever reoccurring problem of the relation between church and state. The question is as Dante's time saw it, whether the political ruler had independent authority and sovereign authority, or was subordinate to the spiritual authority of God's vicar on earth, the Pope. The question must be judged. Dante argues on the fundamental principle that whatever is repugnant to the intention of nature is contrary to the will of God. The truth has been obscured by a fictitious spirit and by a failure to recognize the primary authority of the Bible, the decrees of the councils, and the writings of the fathers. The argument for the subordination of the empire, that is the state, to the church, on the basis of the analogy of the subordinate relation of the moon representing the empire to the sun representing the church, is without weight, because the analogy is false, and even if it were true, does not really establish the dependence. Nor are various often quoted instances in the Bible any more conclusive. Christ gave Peter, representing the church, the power to loose and bind, but expressly limited this power to the things of heaven, not on earth. First interesting thing here is the idea that secular authority is independent of clerical authority and is sovereign to itself is often a criticism that Catholics make of Protestants. But what's this? This is Dante saying this hundreds of years before Luther. What do you know, Logos?
What do you know?
What do you know? Almost like it was a trend in Western political thought, which was going to develop anyhow. Almost, huh? Let's see. I don't know. Anything you want to say on book three analysis?
No, I'm more interested to see where he's going with this argument and why he's talking about it. Is he pro this? Is he anti this? So far, I don't understand the relevance. It just seems like he's kind of put it here.
Yeah, we'll see. The donation by which the Emperor Constantine, after his conversion and cure of leprosy, granted over the empire to Pope Sylvester was invalid, since it was contrary for him to make the grant of the Pope to receive it. Well, both of those instances are now known to have been totally fabricated, and he's going to say that here. The apologists for papal supremacy have made a strong point of the famed donation of Constantine, and Dante was plainly troubled by it. The donation was proved a forgery by Lorenzo Valla in the 15th century. I don't know, Logos. What does it tell you to me that your entire political order has to be based on a fraud?
That's probably not a good order to support.
Yeah, that's the whole BS about this whole medieval fantasy that Catholics have. The entire political order the papacy was articulating was based on two lies: the donation of Constantine, and then the fact that Pope Sylvester cured him of leprosy. If those two things aren't true, then the entire medieval order collapses. So why can't we just blame Lorenzo Valla?
Who's Lorenzo Valla?
He's the guy that proved it was a forgery.
Ah, okay. How'd he prove it? That sounds like an interesting tale.
Well, that was where we get the science of textual criticism.
Ah, okay.
So basically, what Lavala did was he's like, having read literature from the time of Constantine, the 4th century A.D., he then read the donation, and there's anachronisms. There's things being said in there that couldn't have been said in the 4th century.
Right. Okay.
That's where we get. That's where we get. See, you see, I actually think it's the Renaissance that brought down the Catholic Church, because by inventing things like textual criticism, they then just went through all of these claims and just tore them to pieces.
I absolutely believe that. Yeah.
And it's more like the Protestants saw this and they're like, yeah, we're gonna bag this, but we're
Yep.
not gonna give up Christianity, right? The Renaissance was like, yeah, Christianity's bad, let's be pagan again. And the Protestants are like, no, no, Christianity, we can save it, but we can just, we can accept your discoveries of all these Catholic frauds, and then we will, try to keep Christianity. I
Yeah.
mean, that's far more plausible than the narrative you and I've heard. You know,
Yep.
the argument that there cannot be two supreme individuals of the same kind, since the Pope cannot be regarded as inferior, he must be held superior to the temporal ruler, does not hold. Spiritual and temporal authorities are of two different kinds, and the individual supreme in one order might well be inferior in the other. Positively indicating the independence of the temporal rule from the spiritual are such facts as that Christ, Paul, and even the angels who appeared to Paul acknowledge the temporal authority of the emperor. Finally, it is in a harmonious accord with the twofold nature of man, both body and spirit, that God should have established, directly dependent only on himself, two supreme authorities, one temporal and one spiritual. The temporal ruler then is in no way subordinate in temporal things to the spiritual ruler, though it may be granted that he should properly give the reverence to the spiritual ruler which is due him as representative of eternal life and formal felicity. Okay, this is, I think, what you're getting at, Logos. Where he's going with this, and let's consider the outline of what we may call the formal argument. Oh, here we go, Logos. Formalism. You ready?
Oh, I'm ready. Let's see.
Argument of demonarchia. In the first place, we may note that Dante's ultimate goal, eternal salvation in heaven, is meaningless, since heaven exists, if at all, outside of space and time, and can therefore have no bearing on political action.
That's not true.
No, no, it's not.
I mean, if 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 getting to heaven depends upon how you act on earth,
Yeah.
and if how you act on earth is dependent on things like right teaching, civilization, um, like we talked in our Christianity streams about like the Pythagoreans, for example. Maybe they might have gotten to heaven given what they believe because they were able to see certain things about nature and develop some reverence to some godlike thing, even if they weren't like perfect. Um, so it takes a good degree of institutions, learning, values, and so on, um, to make it without Christianity, or it takes like trade routes, roads for Christianity to spread if you're a Christian, say. So I mean, this idea of heaven is greatly related with what happens on earth. I mean, this is just crazy.
Yeah. Second, the lesser goals are derived from the ultimate goal, the development of the full potentialities of all men, universal peace in a single unified world state. Though they are not perhaps inconceivable, are nevertheless altogether utopian and materially impossible. That seems to be what you were getting at. If empires always don't pan out, maybe we should stop with the idea of empire.
Right.
Okay. Third, the many arguments that Dante uses in favor of this position are from a purely formal point of view, both good and bad, mostly bad. But from the point of view of actual political conditions in the actual world of space and time and history, they are almost without exception completely irrelevant. They consist of pointless metaphysical and logical distinctions, distorted analogies, garbled historical references, appeals to miracles and arbitrarily selected authorities, and the task of giving us information about how men behave, about the nature and laws of political life, about what steps may be taken in practice to achieve concrete political and social goals. They advance us not a single step.
Well,
So,
now before we move on, what do you mean arbitrarily selected authorities? what would a non-arbitrarily selected authority look like? And is there any way to non-arbitrarily select an authority that isn't based on a moral axiom?
True, and all the authorities that Moldbug has so far reduced for his own position, aren't they just
They have to
arbitrary?
be, because he's not allowed to question why the authority got authority in the first place. You're only able to just recognize that they have it, which makes it basically arbitrary.
I think the real thing that Moldbug is taking issue with here is the spiritual element, because he said that spiritual beliefs or realities can't have any impact on the physical.
Sure, but I mean,
Yeah, I know.
like I said, like I want to say 3 weeks ago now, or 4 weeks ago, it's a ways back when he brought this up again. This whole idea that it's like we should have no moral picking and choosing about who has authority or why. And then it's like the two buttons in front of Moldbug, right? It's like the meme with the guy with the two red buttons, right? Red button one is we shouldn't let any moral axioms or prescription decide who has authority. Button two is we shouldn't let people have authority based on spurious metaphysical, philosophical, religious, or
Yeah.
spiritual things. It's like, which button you gonna push, Moldbug? Because if you push the second one, you have a moral condition for who is and isn't allowed to authority, and reasons they are or are not allowed to claim why they have authority. But if you push the first button, if it just so happened to be that the people who have all the power claim to on religious grounds or whatever, and everybody believed them, well then guess what? Formalism just recognizes their authority, and that's that. Everything else is pointless.
Well, yeah, on formalist grounds, if it happened to be that those were just the kinds of arguments that would convince the most people without
Yeah,
the use of unnecessary force, then that would be desirable.
exactly. Like, this whole thing doesn't make sense. Every time I see arbitrary from Moldbug now, I just cringe, because his entire system, by his own admission, is designed to make who has authority arbitrary. So it's like, well,
Yeah.
then what do you want?
Right. Right. I mean, the okay. Taking the treatise at face value and judging it as a study of politics, it is worthless, totally worthless. With this, it might seem that no more could or ought be said about the monarchia. Such a conclusion, however, would show a thorough failure to understand the nature of the work of this kind. So far, we have been considering only the formal meaning of the treatise. But this formal meaning, the meaning which is explicitly stated, is the least important aspect of demonarchia. The formal meaning, besides what it explicitly states when taken at face value, serves to express in an indirect and distinguished manner what may be called the real meaning of the essay. By the real meaning, I refer to the meaning not in the terms of the mythical world of religion, metaphysics, miracles, and pseudo history, which is the world of the formal reading of demonarchia, but in terms of the actual world of space, time, and events. To understand the real meaning, we cannot take the words at face value, nor confine our attention to what they explicitly state. We must fit them into the specific context of Dante's time and his own life. It is characteristic of demonarchia and of all similar treatises that there should be thus divorce between formal and real meanings. That the formal meaning should not explicitly state, but only indirectly express, and to one or another extent hide and distort the real meaning. The real meaning is thereby rendered irresponsible, since it is not subject to open and deliberate intellectual control, but the real meaning is nonetheless there. I mean, with this kind of a distinction, you could just look at, say, what Moldbug would take for granted, this sort of scientific worldview where you make references to the origin of the universe and the Big Bang and Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and man pursuing his own rational self-interest in a Lockean position. How is that not all essentially the same thing as pseudo history, miracles, and arbitrary authorities?
I mean, he literally likened the government to like a contest of chimps, and either
That
the
too.
old chimp's gonna win or the young chimp's gonna win. I mean, what is that? Instead of talking about like the divine right of kings, you just have, well, I should rule because I'm the strongest chimp or something. Like, I he protests too much.
Methink he doth protest too much. Yes. I am arbitrarily defining. Oh, what's this, Logos? He's arbitrarily defining now. What's going on?
Right?
Sorry. Hey, not only that, whatever happened to this, like, WWE of philosophers? I thought Moldbug said he was supposed to give the most charitable reading of Dante. It doesn't sound very charitable to me.
I don't know. I guess it's not Dante's turn for the WWE match, but he'll get his charitable reading sometime.
Let's. I'm arbitrarily defining the distinction between formal meaning and real meaning, in the sense I've indicated, and I shall continue to so use it. The distinction has nothing to do with the psychological question whether Dante or any other writer who may be in question consciously attempts to deceive his audience by hiding the real meaning behind the facade of a formal meaning. My gosh, Logos, who is he? He's not talking about Dante. He's talking about himself.
Yep.
The disguise is there independently of any intention, and deception, including self-deception, does often occur. It is possible, of course, as we shall see further, that the formal meaning and the real meaning should be identical, and it is an object of science to see so far as possible they are. Okay.
An object of science.
Science, bro. No, but think about this, Logos.
Kill me.
Given Moldbug's latest shenanigans and turning against his base, and losing a lot of support that way, I think this paragraph is actually really interesting.
Yep.
Because he's describing what he's doing in 2000. What we've seen this year was already planned as of 2007, because he says the disguise is there. Independently of any intention and deception, including self-deception, does it often occur. It is possible, of course, as we shall see further, that the formal meaning and the real meaning should be identical. So the thing is, a lot of the stuff that you and I are criticizing about Moldbug, well, okay, there's two elements, right? The formal meaning is his, completely incomprehensible list of completely arbitrary authorities and interpretations and words and everything else. That's the formal meaning. The real meaning, I guess, we sort of saw with Finargle. Even that wasn't very well stated either. So I think that's how we can. Would you agree that's where we're at this point with Moldbug?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What then is the real reading of Monarchia? The real meaning of demonarchia. From the 12th to the 14th centuries, many of the chief disputes and wars in feudal Europe focused around the struggle between the Guelphs and Ghibellines. The exact origin of these two great international factions is not altogether clear. They first came into prominence in the year 1125 in a conflict over the succession to the Emperor Henry V, a member of the Hohenstaufen family. His son Frederick, supported by the great nobles, claimed the empire, which was not, however, a hereditary office. He was opposed by the Pope and by many other lesser nobles whose candidate was Lothar, the Duke of Saxony. Lothar was elected, but upon his death in 1137, was succeeded by the brother of Frederick, the Hohenstaufen Conrad, who was in turn in 1152 followed by the great Hohenstaufen Frederick Barbarossa. The Guelph faction took its name from the party of Lothar, and the Ghibelline from the party of Hohenstaufen. The exact significance of the division varied from period to period, but in a general lineup, and most of the time the Guelphs were the party of the papacy, and the Ghibellines the party of the empire. On the whole, the greater feudal nobles were Ghibellines, especially in the Germanic states and in Italy. As a counterweight to them, the Pope brought many of the Italian city-states into the Guelph camp, in particular the rising burgher class of the city-states, which was already in internal conflict with the great nobles at home. This distinction, however, holds only in general. Often adherence to one or other of the factions was the device to secure special and temporary advantages independent of the overall division. For example, the House of France during the 13th century inclined towards the Guelphs in order to secure leverage against the empire. The two of the junior members of the French royal family, Charles of Anjou and Charles of Valois, were among the leading champions of the Guelphs. The Italian cities similarly often chose sides in such a way as to aid them most in settling local and immediate problems. By the later half of the 12th century, the emperor ruled over most of the Germanic areas and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which included most of southern Italy. The major expansive aim of the empire was to secure control of the cities of northern Italy, the richest and most prosperous cities of all Europe. The object of the papacy and of the cities themselves, or at least the burghers of the cities, was to blockade the advance of the empire. The papacy set out to destroy the Hohenstaufen family, which led the empire and which the popes rightfully understood to be the core of the Ghibelline faction. After a century of struggle, this was done. The hold of the empire on the kingdom of the Sicilies was broken by the Guelph Charles of Anjou, and the last of the Hohenstaufen family, the romantic youth Conradin, was slaughtered after his defeat by Charles in the Battle of Tagliacozzo in 1268, 3 years after the birth of Dante. The struggle, however, continued in the empire, still kept its strength fixed on the Italian cities. Now, Florence, Dante's own seething, rich, dynamic city, the leader of Tuscany and one of the chief states of the late medieval world, became a great and uncompromising bulwark of the Guelph faction. Machiavelli, in his History of Florence, describes how internal conflicts within Florence broadened to join the international Guelph-Ghibelline division. In the course of a private quarrel, a group headed by the Uberti family assassinated a member of the Buondelmonti family. This murder divided the whole city, part of it siding with the Buondelmonti and part with the Uberti. And both the families being powerful in houses, castles, and men, the quarrel continued many years before either could be ejected. Yet, though the animosity could not be extinguished by a firm and stable peace, yet things were palliated and composed sometimes for the present by certain truces and cessations, by which means, according to the variety of accidents, there were sometimes at quiet and sometimes together by the ears. And this condition, Florence continued till the reign of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, emperor from 1215 to 1250, who, being king of Naples and desirous to strengthen himself against the church, to corroborate his interest in Tuscany, joined himself to the Uberti and to the party, by whose assistance the Buondelmonti were driven out of Florence, and that city, as all Italy had done before, began to divide into factions of Guelphs and Ghibellines. The triumphs of the Ghibellines in Florence was, however, brief, was only natural in a city which was beginning a great commercial and industrial expansion, in terms of which the old line nobility was a constant drain and obstinance. The death of Frederick II in 1250 gave the Florentine Guelphs their chance to overthrow the Ghibelline rule and exile the leaders of the Ghibelline faction. The Ghibellines returned temporarily to power after a victory in 1260, but were again indefinitely driven out with the help of Charles of Anjou. In 1266, a result which was a phase of the broader campaign of the Pope and Charles against the last of the Hohenstaufen. After a number of experiments in internal administration, the government of the city, firmly Guelph, gravitated into the hands of the merchant guilds, now representing the chief social force in the town. Membership in a guild became a prerequisite of political office. The executive power was held by a body of 6 priors, elected every 2 months from each of the 6 wards into which Florence was divided. In 1293, the remarkable ordinances of justice placed heavy legal disabilities on the great nobles as individuals and as a class. Nobility, it was said, became a disgrace in the commercially based democracy of the Florentine Republic. The hope that the suppression of the Ghibellines would end domestic turmoil in Florence quickly vanished. There was too much life there for tranquility. In 1300, the dominant Florentine Guelphs themselves split into new factional divisions, the Neri blacks and Bianchi whites. Here is Machiavelli's account. Never was the city in greater splendor, nor more happy in its condition, that then abounding both in men and riches and reputation. They had 3,000 citizens in the town fit to bear arms, and 70,000 more in their territory. All Tuscany was as its devotion, partly as subjects and partly as friends. And though there were still piques and suspicions betwixt the nobility and the people, yet they did not break out into any ill effect, but all lived quietly and peaceably together. And had not this tranquility been at length interrupted by dissension within, it had been in no danger from abroad. Being in such terms at the time, it neither feared the empire nor its exiles, i.e. the Ghibellines, and could have brought a force into the field equivalent to all the rest of the states in Italy, but that disease from which ab extra it was secure was engendered in its own bowels. There were 2 families in Florence, the Cerci and the Donati, equally considerable both in numbers and riches and dignity, being neighbors both in city and country. There happened some expectations and discuss between them, but not so great as to bring them to blows, and perhaps they would never have produced any considerable effects had not their ill humors been agitated and fermented by new occasion. Among the chief families in Pistoia, there was a family of the Cancelleri. It appealed that Laura, the son of Giulino, and Jerry, the son of Bertaccio, fell out by accident at play and passing from words to blows. Jerry received a slight wound. Girolamo was much troubled at the business, and thinking by excessive humility to take off the scandal, he increased it and made it worse. He commanded his son to go to Jerry's father's house and demand his pardon. Laura obeyed and went as his father directed, but the act of humanity did not at all sweeten the acerbity of Baraccio's mind, and caused Laura to be seized by his servants. To aggravate the indignity, he caused him to be led by them to the stable, and his hands cut off upon the manger, with instruction to return to his father and to let him know that wounds are not cured so properly by words as by amputation. Girolamo was so enraged at the cruelty of the fact, as he and his friends immediately took arms to revenge it. And Bertaccio and his friends doing as much to defend themselves, the whole city of Pistoia was engaged in a quarrel and divided into two parties. These Cancelleri, being both of them descendants from one of the Cancelleri, who had two wives, and one of them called Bianca, that party which was descended from her called itself Bianca, and the other in opposition, because the name Bianca has the same meaning as the word for white, was called Nera, black. In a short time, many conflicts happened betwixt them, many men killed and many houses destroyed. Not being able to accommodate among themselves, though both sides were weary, they concluded to come to Florence, hoping some expedient would be found out there, or else to fortify their parties by the acquisition of new friends. The Neri, having had familiarity with the Donati, were espoused by Corso, the head of that family. The Bianchi, to support themselves against the ascension of the Donati, fell in with the chief of the Churchi, a man not inferior to Corso in any quality whatsoever. In the month of May, several holidays being publicly celebrated in Florence, certain young gentlemen of the Donati, with their friends on horseback, having stopped near St. Trinity to see certain women that were dancing, it fell out that some of the Churchi arrived there likewise with some of their friends, and being desirous to see as well as the rest, not knowing the Donati were before, they spurred on their horses and jostled in among them. The Donati looked upon it as an affront, drew their swords. The Churchi were as ready to answer them, and after several cuts and slashes given and received, both sides retired. This accident was the occasion of a great mischief. The whole city, as well as the people, as people as the nobility, divided and took part with the Bianchi and the Neri, and their inclinations directed. Nor did this humor extend itself only in the city, but infected the whole country, that is, all of Tuscany. Inasmuch as the captains of the arts, i.e. the guilds, and such as favored the Guelphs and were lovers of the Commonwealth, very much apprehended lest this new distraction should prove the ruin of the city and the restoration of the Ghibellines. The last sentence gives the key to the meaning of the new division. The Neri faction, however it did in fact originate, was made up of the firm and unyielding ultra-Guelphs. The Bianchi were a centrist group inclined to try a compromise and bridge the gulf between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Dante, as an active citizen of Florence, had been brought up as a Guelph. He had enrolled in the Guild of Druggists and Physicians in order to be eligible for political office. When the new conflict broke out, he lined up with the Bianchi faction, although at first apparently he concealed his allegiance under cover of impartiality. In 1300, he was elected as one of the 6 priors for the term June 15th to August 15th. The new conflict had by then become threatening. Dante and his fellow priors, as the chief magistrates of the city, made the mistake of trying to resolve it by banishing simultaneously several leaders of both factions. Presumably this was a deceptive manner by the Bianchi, who thought thereby to get rid of the Neri leaders and then to readmit their own men at the first opportunity. The Neri, however, were not so easily reconciled. They were determined, and they had much firmer line than the Bianchi, who were in reality vacillating between the major camps of Guelphs and Ghibellines. The Neri made a clever move. They appealed to the Pope, Boniface VIII, to arbitrate the dispute. He sent as his delegate to Florence Cardinal Mato. I'm not even going to pronounce that. It was hard to make an open objection to this procedure. What more natural and fair than that spiritual head of Christendom should intervene to compose the quarrels of his erring children? In truth, however, as we have seen, the Pope was the leader of the Guelphs. The object of his intervention would be to swing the decision to his firmest political supporters, the Neri. This the Bianchi well knew, and they therefore refused to accept the offices of Cardinal Matteo, who departed, leaving the city under an interdict. Their religious arm having failed, Boniface turned to the secular. He called upon his old allies of the House of France. At his request, Charles of Valois, brother of King Philip, came to Italy on November the 1st, 1301, and entered Florence in a great state, still nominally as arbitrator and pacifier. he quickly arranged a purge of the Bianchi. There was an issue. On January the 27th, 1302, a decree of fines and 2 years' banishment against Dante and a number of his colleagues. When this was discharged, a sterner decree was published on March the 10th, calling for the death by burning of Dante and 14 others if they should fall into the hands of the Republic. They were forced thus into exile. There then occurred what had been sure from the beginning of the Neri Bianchi division. The Bianchi, routed within Florence, were too weak to recover power unaided. Their only possible allies were the remaining Ghibellines of Tuscany, with whom the Bianchi joined. Before long, the Bianchi, toppled from their hopeless center position, were themselves full-fledged Ghibellines. The united Bianchi-Ghibelline forces, however, were still not strong enough. Their attempts to re-enter Florence by force were repulsed. In a state of disintegration, the last and only hope seemed to be the ancient core of the Ghibelline faction, the empire itself. And to the empire their dreams turned. The emperor would come like an avenging leopard to crush the pride and insolence of the unbridled Florence. Since the Pope's success against the Hohenstaufen, however, the empire, under the guidance for the first time of the cautious and remarkable Habsburg family, had curbed its ambitions and stayed at home. But the new star of the House of Luxembourg was rising. To it, the embittered Ghibellines of Tuscany chained their hopes. In 1308, Henry of Luxembourg was declared emperor as Henry VII. Dante, in a series of bombastic public letters, called upon his Roman sword to smite the wicked of the church in the cities, and restore Italy to its imperial grandeur. O Italy, henceforth rejoice, though now to be pitied by the very Saracens, yet soon to be envied throughout the world, because thy bridegroom, the most clement Henry, Divus, and Augustus, and Caesar, is hastening to the bridal. Dry thy tears and remove thy marks of grief, O thou fairest one, for nigh at hand is he who shall release thee from the prison of the impious, and smiting the malicious shall destroy them with the edge of the sword, and shall give out his vineyard to the other husbandmen, such as shall render the fruit of justice at a time of harvest. But you, Florentines, you transgress divine and human law, whom a dire rapaciousness hath found ready to be drawn into it every crime. Doth not the dread of the second death pursue you? For ye first and alone, shunning the yoke of liberty, have murmured against the glory of the Roman prince, the king of the world and minister of God, and on the plea of prescriptive right have refused the duty of the submission which he owed, and have rather risen up in the insanity of rebellion. Henry did at last come down into Italy, but he could make up his mind to do nothing. He dallied sluggishly with his army, undertaking and lifting half-hearted sieges of the towns. In 1313 he fell ill and died. The rhetorical balloons of the Ghibelline exiles thus ingloriously burst. Dante never re-entered Florence. The rest of his days were spent wandering among the households of the remaining Ghibelline princes in northern Italy. His revenge on his Guelph enemies had been to be satisfied by throwing them into the worst torments of his inferno. For Boniface VIII, ultimate author of his defeats, though he was not dead in 1300, the date which Dante assigns to his journey through hell and purgatory and heaven, a particularly hideous spot in hell is duly reserved and waiting, Inferno, Canto 19. Nicholas III, Boniface's predecessor, is already there, stuffed headfirst into a narrow hole with flames moving externally over both his feet. As Dante goes by, he stops to talk to the inverted Nicholas. With a marvelous sense of irony, Nicholas is made to mistake Dante for Boniface. We are now in a position to understand the real meaning of the monarchia. Eternal salvation, the highest development of man's potentialities, everlasting peace, unity, and harmony, the deliberate balance of abstract relationships between church and state. All these ghosts and myths evaporate, along with the whole elaborate structure of theology, metaphysics, allegory, miracle, and fable. The entire formal meaning, which has told us nothing and proved nothing, assumes its genuine role of merely expressing and distinguishing the real meaning. This real meaning is simply an impassioned propagandistic defense of the point of view of the turncoat Bianchi exiles from Florence, specifically and more generally of the broader Ghibelline point of view to which the Bianchi capitulated. The monarchia is, as we might say, a Ghibelline party platform. Now, I'm going to argue this is an entirely unfair way to treat Dante. Obviously, the people who ended up in hell in the first book of the Divine Comedy, some of them were people that wronged Dante directly, but but basically what Moldbug is saying is because modern people like himself are only motivated by such solely motivated by such petty goals, that everybody else in the past must have been solely motivated by such petty goals. And that's just not true. I think that's entirely unfair to Dante.
Seems kind of universalist too, doesn't it?
Oh, well, why don't you explain?
Well, I mean the entire previous essay which Moldbug featured was saying that civilizations attributing civilized behavior to the tribal societies that are to be just like them, despite not knowing anything about them or anything like that, was basically a universalist fallacy, right? The myth of the noble savage. Well, I mean, if we just take that line of reasoning, then attributing all of our modern goals, ways of thinking about the world, and so on to people in past civilizations, just because we live in civilizations or whatnot, um, also seems to be a strain of the same fallacy.
Right. And actually, this is actually kind of surprising because this is not where I thought Moldbug was going to go. See, what I thought Moldbug was going to say was because, okay, in demonarchia, we have a king, we have a formalist structure of monarchy. By giving us this lurid account of Florence's civil strife, I thought he was going to say that Dante was a formalist who was trying to create a political order that would spare Florence further civil strife. He didn't even go there, which I thought
Yeah.
was interesting. But all right, the ostensible goals of the formal argument are noble, high-minded, which people often call idealistic. This serves to create a favorable emotional response to the reader, to disarm him, to lead him to believe in the goodwill of the author. Logos, is Moldbug describing himself in all this?
I mean, that's been your hypothesis the whole time. Might as well keep running with it.
I think it works. The unwary reader carries this attitude over to the practical aims of the real argument. But what of these latter aims? What do they concretely amount to? When we dig behind the formal facade, they emerge as vengeful and reactionary. All right, you ready for this, Logos? He's just butthurt at all these other progressives who are looking down their nose at him in college. That's all it is. That's all this is, This is his divine comedy, right? You are, and then the gray mirror. This is just him getting revenge on all these people that slighted him in school.
Yep.
There we go. They are the aims of an embittered and incompetent set of traitors. Dante and his friends had failed miserably in their political careers. They had been defeated in an attempt to take over the government of their country. Quite properly, in accordance with the customs of the time and for the interests of internal security, they had been exiled. Wait, Logos. Actually, no. Dante was wildly successful. Let me explain, right? The Pope represents the Guelphs, right? And of course, the Guelphs were his political enemies. So by writing a political treatise that puts the secular civil authority over the Pope, he then began a process that led to the dissolution of papal authority.
Yep.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So doesn't that mean that Dante had the last laugh here?
It does.
Quite properly, in accordance with the customs of the time and for the interests of internal security, they had been exiled. Then they joined with the disintegrated forces of earlier exiles whose only wish was to revenge themselves on Florence and destroy her power. The large group also failed. They then crawled slavishly to the feet of the Republic's oldest and most thorough enemy, the Emperor, begging him to do what they were too weak and too stupid to have done. The aims of the empire in northern Italy were very far indeed from eternal salvation, universal peace, and the highest development of man's potentialities. The empire clutched greedily after the amazing wealth and resources of these remarkable cities and dreamed of reducing their proud, fierce independence to the tyrannical rule of its gauleteers. Wait a minute, Logos. So you're saying that these plucky, freedom-loving democracies are going to be oppressed and ruled by tyrants? But that doesn't sound formalist to me, Logos.
Well, Todd, they're not really democracies. They're Schrodinger's democracies. And I mean, whoever rules them may or may not even be formalists.
Maybe. In these days, by an odd conjecture, the papacy with the Guelph faction was supporting the most progressive developments in society. It was the newly rising class of burghers in the cities that were just beginning to break the now withering hand of feudalism. The burghers were expanding trade and industry. Already the splendid woolens finished in Florence, and the gold-pierced florins they were called, which its citizens had resolved to protect against the hitherto universal practice of debasement, were becoming known throughout the Western world. The merchants were reopening up among men links of social communication that involved more of life than war and pillage. Nor was it merely trade and industry that they were advancing. The new riches were being transformed into an art that was perhaps the most magnificent the world has ever known. Giotto himself was Dante's contemporary, and were stimulating a renewed interest in the endless possibilities of truly human knowledge. Naturally, the great nobles looked with alarm. They and their ways could have little place in this new world. The economic position of the nobles rested on the land, on an agriculture carried out by serfs and Willeens tied to the soil. The burghers wanted men to work in the shops. The cities subordinated the countryside to themselves, exploiting itself ruthlessly, it is true, to supply cheap food and raw materials. The nobles trained only for war, conducted as the personal combat of knights and political intrigue. The burghers wanted less war because it interfered with commercial prosperity, and when it came, wanted it for valuable economic ends, a port or a source of supply or a market. They wanted a politics and governed by law instead of personal privilege. Logos, this is sounding pretty dangerous. I mean, Moldbug is defending the rise of, representative government here.
I know, right?
This is dangerous. Whoa.
It sounds pretty Calvinist of him.
I know. It sounds, dare I say it sounds ultra Calvinist of him.
Well, let's not go too far.
The great nobles, in short, and the party of the Ghibellines wanted to stop history short. More wanted to go back to their full day, which was already beginning to end. Its twilight first seems in these Italian cities. Dante, whom commentators willing to judge from surfaces are so fond of calling the first modern man. The precursor of the Renaissance, was their spokesman. His practical political aims toward his country were traitorous. His sociological allegiance was reactionary. Without his exile, true enough, it may well be that he would never have written his poem. A rotten politics, which besides have no applicable influence on the course of political events, was no doubt a small price to pay for so marvelous a human gain. But there is an intellectual advantage in separating the two, the poetry and the politics, for judgment. I mean, this is such a ridiculous nonsense reading. I mean, first of all, by placing the Pope under secular authority and demonarchia, he's already begun the process of upending the entire medieval order, which is then fulfilled in the Renaissance. So that's wildly successful, one. Two, given that the Pope and the Emperor were both foreign elements, and the Guelphs and the Ghibellines in Florence represented both, how does that make Dante a traitor? I mean, the Guelphs had foreign backing in the Pope in France, and then he had backing with the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, by that definition, they're both traitors, but that would be a meaningless thing to say.
Yep.
So we continue. The typical method of political thought. It is easy to dismiss the monarchia as having a solely historical, archaic, or biographical interest. For now, we consider it seriously as a study of the nature and laws of politics, of political behavior and principles. We seldom now talk about eternal salvation in political treatises. There is now no more Holy Roman Empire. A scholastic metaphysics is a mystery for all but the Neo-Thomists. It is not, and we won't get you started on the Neo-Thomist logos. It's not fashionable to settle arguments by appeal to religious miracles and allegorical parables from the Bible or the Fathers. Well, apparently he hasn't been on the dissident online space, has he, Logos?
Say that again?
I said, so he says it's not fashionable to settle arguments by appeal to religious miracles and allegorical parables from the Bible or the Fathers. And I said, Moldbug has obviously not been a party to the online dissident space.
No, clearly not.
Clearly not, because that's all the rage, apparently. Also, this is so, and yet it would be a great error to suppose that Dante's method in De Monarchia is outworn. His method is exactly that of the democratic platform with which we began our inquiry. It has been and continues to be the method of 9/10, yes, more than 9/10 of all writing speaking in the field of politics. The myths, The ghosts, the idealistic abstractions change name and form, but the method persistently remains. It is then important to be entirely clear about the general features of the method. They must be summarized as follows. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. But wait a minute. If he's going to argue that Dante was motivated by resentment, who is FDR having resentment against? I don't get it, right? Like, that doesn't make sense. But we'll get here. There's a sharp divorce between what I have called the formal meaning and the formal aims and arguments, and the real meaning, the real aims and arguments, if there is, as there usually is not, any real argument. Okay, 2. Formal aims and goals are for the most part either or altogether supernatural or metaphysical or transcendent, in both cases meaningless from the point of view of real actions in the real world of space, time, and history. Or, if they have some empirical meaning, are impossible to achieve under the actual conditions of social life. In all 3 cases, the dependence of the whole structure of reasoning upon such goals makes it impossible for the writer or speaker to give a true descriptive account of the way men actually behave. A systematic distortion of the truth takes place, and obviously it cannot be shown how the goals might be reached, since by unreading they cannot be reached. 3. From a purely logical point of view, the arguments offered for the formal aims and goals may be valid or fallacious. But except by accident, they are necessarily irrelevant to the real political problems, since they are designed to prove the ostensible points of the formal structure, points of religion or metaphysics, or the abstract desirability of some utopian ideal. 4. The formal meaning serves as indirect expression of the real meaning, that is, for the concrete meaning of the political treatise taken in its real context and its relation to the actualities of the social and historical situation in which it functions. But at the same time it also disguises the real meaning. We think we are debating universal peace, salvation, a unified world government, and the relations between church and state, when what is really at issue is whether the Florentine Republic is to be run by its own citizens or submitted to the exploitation of a reactionary foreign monarch. Man, Moldbug sounds like a radical universalist here, Logos. What's going on?
It's another Sunday.
Yeah.
Saturday. Man, I never know what day it is. It's another Saturday. We're reading more Moldbug. That's what's going on.
Well, but this is a patently stupid claim. Or submitted to the exploitation of a reactionary foreign monarch. You mean like the French? We just read that the Guelphs brought the French in.
Yep.
Like, this whole thing just doesn't work.
Not to mention, what do you mean submitted to the exploitation of reactionary foreign monarch? I mean, what do you call it when Finargo rules you with a ring of indestructible power? I mean, you're going to be exploited by the ruler. Finargo's exploiting you for gold. This guy's exploiting you probably for something.
No, Logos. That's just rational self-interest, bruh. Like, no exploitation here.
Well, you know what? That just seems like a moral question about when exploitation is a rational self-interest thing or not. And I don't like this moralizing. It doesn't sound very formalist of him.
I know. We're not supposed to do, but
we're not supposed to do that. We're not supposed to question who has authority or why.
But it's also impossible not to do it.
Of course, because nihilism isn't really a true thing. Of course.
We think with the delegates at the Council of Nicaea that the discussion is concerned with the definition of God's essence, when the real problem is whether the Mediterranean world is to be politically centralized under Rome or divided. Okay. I'm gonna give a partial nod of approval here. An emperor can. No, actually, it's not so much. Okay, no. I'm gonna rephrase this. He's partly right here, but he's partly wrong. So there is a real political goal here with Nicaea. It's not. Is the church under the emperor or not? Because it's the emperor that convenes it, and it's the emperor that ultimately has to sign off on it.
Right.
And so there is a very real political reality here, and that the emperor gets to decide what orthodoxy is. And he has to. He can't do it. He can't do it purely by diktat. He has to have, the appearance of support. So he gathers the bishops and they do it. But yeah. We believe we are disputing the merits of a balanced budget or sound currency when the real conflict is deciding what group shall regulate the distribution of the currency. We imagine we are arguing over the moral and legal states of the principle of the freedom of the seas when the real question is who is to control the seas. 5. From this, it follows that the real meaning, the real goal, aims are left irresponsible. In Dante's case, the aims were also vicious and reactionary. This need not be the case, but when this method is used by, they are always irresponsible, even if the real aims are such as to contribute to human welfare. No proof or evidence for this is offered. Proof and evidence, so far as they are present at all, remain at the formal level. The real aims are accepted, even if right, for the wrong reasons. The high-minded words of the formal meaning serve only to arouse passion and prejudice and sentimentality in favor of the disguised real aims. This method, whose intellectual consequence is merely to confuse and hide, can teach us nothing of the truth and can in no way help us to solve the problems of our political. Okay, that's you are in a nutshell. This one statement is you are in a nutshell. This method, whose intellectual consequence is merely to confuse and hide, can teach us nothing of the truth, can in no way help us to solve the problem of our political life. Right, Logos?
Well, also, I thought that he wasn't going to give you a full ideology to solve the problems of your political life. I thought the entire point of this was a DIY method to make your own ideology, to figure out your own way to solve your own problems.
Yeah, well, I guess now we have Schrodinger's political life.
Yeah, Schrodinger's problem-solving toolbox.
In the hands of the powerful and their spokesmen, however, used by demagogues and hypocrites, or simply the self-deluded, this method is well designed and the best to deceive us and to lead us by easy routes to the sacrifice of our own interest and dignity in the service of the mighty. Man, that sounds dangerously radical, bro. I don't know
Sounds
about
like
that one.
formalism.
All right, there's a lot that was here in these 5 points. Is there anything you want to just start dealing with them one at a time?
Sure, why not?
Okay, well, let's look at the first one. So what do you? Well, there's a lot we could say about the first one, but what do you want to say about it?
I mean, he's not completely wrong. There are some arguments that will kind of wrap itself in the vernacular of whatever the language is to make itself like look good. Like the left makes arguments today, and they're all about diversity and inclusion, equity. Maybe they'll bring up stuff like stochastic terrorism. There's always the buzzwords of the day that you use to kind of run the argument. And there's a distinction between like brass tacks. Okay, what are you really trying to get the government to do?
Yeah.
So one doesn't seem terrible. Two, the formal aims and goals are for the most part either supernatural or metaphysical transcendental. Not always.
Well, you know, he talks about empirical a bit later.
Yeah, meaningless from the point of view of real actions in the real world in space and time, or they have some empirical meaning are impossible to achieve under the actual conditions of social life. Yeah, I guess that's kind of true.
Well, hold on, Logos. You know what that's most true of?
What?
Freaking libertarianism.
Oh, yeah. Let's just go to Ring of
Which
Finargle
is-
and everything will be okay.
Yeah, and the Ring of Finargle, and this entire
Yeah.
project of Moldbug. I mean,
Right. Yeah.
the entire project of libertarianism to like, you know, corporate monarchy to Finargle, all of this is number 2.
Yep.
Okay, number 3.
From a purely logical point of view, the arguments offered for the formal aims and goals may be valid or fallacious, but except by accident, they are necessarily irrelevant to real political problems. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. I'm going to give a really, really good example of this. Here's one. I would argue that the DEI argument of representation is a very formal argument because they know it's going to preach to the choir. They know it's just going to be arguments that the people who control levers of power need to hear. Is kind of a window dressing for what they actually want to do in government. That being said, what's being appealed to isn't altogether irrelevant, else it wouldn't be successful. So, the example I always bring up, if you have on paper a society that says you'll have like equal access under the law to different services and goods and economic mobility and things like this. But every time you do a study to try to like put that to the test, like, okay, is this working the way the society says on paper? And you keep getting statistical results that say for certain demographics or whoever else, they're not equally getting access to these resources or so on, then you have a real problem on your hands, like an existential one, right? Because it begs the hypothesis, it begs the question, when are your on-paper policies actually failing. So it could be the demographic that's failing to live up to its responsibilities in society to make best use of the resources. True. It could be society that's not working best with the demographics despite the way it should be on paper. Also true. The question isn't irrelevant. The question is really important, because if the society is lying about living up to its responsibilities to certain demographics, that's a recipe for social disaster. So you can call it a lot of things, but irrelevant isn't one of them, even if it's a formal argument. So
Yeah.
I'm not sold on 3.
No, I'm not either. Okay, 4 is a bit big, so here's 4.
Okay, the formal meaning serves as an indirect expression of the real meaning. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, its relation to the actuality is a social historical situation, but at the same time, we think it also distinguishes the real meaning. We think we are debating universal peace, salvation, unified rule of government, blah, 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 blah. Whether the Florentine Republic is to be run by its own citizens or so. Yeah, 4 is fine.
Yeah, 4 is fine. And
Yeah.
to put Moldbug under 4, all of the arguments we've heard so far, and again, the anger and the resentment that he has against progressives is palpable. So it's pretty clear that, say, like Matthew Iglesias is like, well, that should have been my job. Why did you get it?
Right.
I mean, that's literally that was the whole article. There's a whole article on Iglesias, like, well, basically, why did you get this position and not me?
Right.
And so, who's Dante now, buddy?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, 5.
From it follows the real meaning, the real goal and aims are left irresponsible. I don't know what that means. In Dante's case, the aims were also vicious and reactionary. Well, I'm not a historian. You can say what you want about that. This need not be the case, but when this method is used, they are always irresponsible. Really? I'm not sure about.
I don't. It doesn't follow.
I think I'll have to think about this one, because I could have sworn I've heard Moldbug. I think it might have been in the article about like how to dissolve the United States or something. Made arguments in a similar vein. So would he be responsible if the newly corporatized United States makes this kind of like narrative argument to like restructuring itself and paying some of its citizens like some shareholder pittance or something to completely restructure the government? Like, I don't know. It seems like he's going to have to make this argument to kind of get consent from the governed. And I don't think he'd think it's irresponsible for him to do so. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. Okay, almost done. The chief historical effects of the French Revolution were to break up the system of the French monarchy with its privileged financiers and courtiers, to remove a number of feudal restrictions on capitalist methods of production, and to put the French capitalists in a position of greater social power. Man, that sounds like a dangerously socialistic reading of history, Logos.
Yep.
Whoa. Well, I don't know, Moldbug. I think your libertarian cred is in trouble here. It might have been argued prior to the revolution that these goals promised to contribute to the welfare of the French people and perhaps of mankind. Evidence for and against this expectation might have been assembled. However, this was not the procedure generally followed by the ideologists of the revolution. They based their treatises not upon an examination of the facts, but upon supposedly fundamental and really quite mythical notions of the primitive state of nature, the natural goodness of man, the social contract, and similar nonsense. Naturally, the workers, peasants were disappointed by the outcome after so much blood, but oddly enough, most of France seemed to feel not too many years later that the aims of the revolution were well enough realized in the dictatorship of Bonaparte. No doubt, European unification under Mustache Man would have been evil for the European peoples in the world, but this has no more proved by complicated deductions to show that the derivation of NS through thought from Hegelian dialectic and the philosophical poetry of Nietzsche than is the contradictory by Mustache Man's own mystic pseudo-biology. Freedom from want is very nearly as meaningless in terms of real politics as eternal salvation. Men are wanting beings. They are freed from want only by death. Well, you know what else, Logos, is as meaningless as eternal salvation and freedom from want? Self-ownership.
Yep.
Whatever the book or article or speech or political matters that we turn to, those of a journalist like Pierre van Passen, a demagogue like Mustache Man, a professor like Marx Lerner, a chairman of the sociology department. Oh, here we go, Logos. This is the whole point of this article. I'm mad that I'm not in these teaching positions.
Yep.
So there we go. I guess basically he's the reactionary Dante motivated by low motives. So I guess instead of the reactionary Holy Roman Empire, he wants the reactionary corporate apparatus to back him up. Chairman of sociology department like Pitram Sorkin, revolutionist like Lenin, a trapped idealist like Henry Wallace, a bulldozing rhetorician like Churchill, a preacher out of a church like Norman Thomas, or one in like Bishop Manning, the Pope, or the ministers of the Mikado. In the case of all of them, we find that though they may be incidental passages which increase our fund of real information, the integrating method in the whole conception of politics is precisely that of Dante. Gods, whether of progress or the Old Testament, ghosts or sightly revolutionary ancestors, abstracted moral imperatives, ideas cut off wholly from the mere earth and mankind, utopias beckoning from the marsh of never, never land. These, and not the facts of social life, together with probable generalizations based on these facts, exercise the final controls over arguments and conclusions. Political analysis becomes like are their dreams, the expression of human wish or an admission of a practical failure. The one other thing that I'll add is also as meaningless as freedom from want is man is a rational actor in the market.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, Logos. Well, this all could have been said like in 4 paragraphs.
It really could have. This was like quite a slog to go through.
It was pointless. How can you write so much and say so little? I mean, look at how long this is. So here's what I'm thinking we might do. I'll take a brief break from reading Moldbug because there's a very interesting thing that I brought up to you earlier today, Logos, which I want to show with the audience.
Nice.
So, Moldbug is basically Tealbucks. I knew something was fishy about this guy. So this is from Reason Magazine, Brian Doherty. Wait, wasn't Peter Thiel a libertarian? So what do we have here? Yarvin is perhaps better known for the pen name under which he rose to internet fame in the late 2000s and early 2010s, Mencius Moldbug. And his Unqualified Reservations blog, Moldbug, a software entrepreneur by day and unspooled, head-spinning, long-winded neo-reactionary screeds, wielding a broadsword of abandoned pre-Enlightenment wisdom against the squalid lies of equality, democracy, and the smothering tyranny of what he calls the communist progressive cathedral. Back then, the cathedral ruled the discourse so totally and viciously that it wasn't prudent, perhaps wasn't even safe, to burden Moldbug's true identity with his brutally honest thoughts. But TechCrunch outed Moldbug as Yarvin in 2013, and in the Trump era, he seems happy enough to publicly be himself. Yarvin, a follower of the 19th century British polemicist Thomas Carlyle, is the type of outside-the-box thinker who argues that monarchy is inherently better than democracy, that street crime is more of a danger to his readers' lives and of all government's depredations, and that one of the worst sins of modernity is that people refuse to speak candidly about IQ differences across human types. Such notions are by no means new to the American right, but they feel fresh again in 2020, not only because libertarianism has made some inroads against conservative traditionalism over the last few decades, but also because Yarvin's extreme anti-cosmopolitanism comes from a genuinely modern twist. He is connected via friendship, venture capital, and at least some ideological affinity with one of America's wealthiest and most controversial men, the tech tycoon Peter Thiel. Okay, so there's some more Thiel. Oh, hold on here. Let's look for Yarvin. Okay. Okay. Thiel, whom the George Mason economist Tyler Cowen in 2019 called the most influential conservative intellectual with other conservative and libertarian intellectuals, is co-founder of PayPal, the big data analytics firm Palantir Technologies, and the trailblazing venture capital group Founders Fund. The latter entity has funded Yarvin's software company Plan. The company's CEO Galen Wolfe-Powley told The Verge in 2017, Yarvin and Thiel watched the 2016 election results together, according to a BuzzFeed-obtained email exchange between Yarvin and the alt-right provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos. Peter needs guidance on our politics for sure, Yiannopoulos posited in one of the messages. Less than you might think, Yarvin responded. He's fully enlightened. He just plays it very carefully. Both Thiel and Yarvin trace the ruination of tech education and governing culture to the dominance of progressive political correctness. Associates of Thiel say the financier does not consider himself neo-reactionary, though he did write as far back as 2009 that I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible. That was the same year Yarvin as Moldbug wrote that socialism and fascism produced a mix of substandard and disastrous results for the simple reason both originate in democracy, a pernicious growth always pregnant with some malignancy. Was it earlier they said, no, it's different, okay. Some more for Yarvin, let's see here. Okay, we'll skip that. Yeah, so there does seem to be a pretty cushy relationship between Yarvin and Thiel, and that seems to be could help explain Yarvin's meteoric rise.
Yep.
And there you go. I thought that was interesting when I saw that, because like someone like Moldbug just doesn't come out of nowhere. Like, obviously, I haven't had the success of Moldbug, so there's clearly something, or even more suspicious, the fact that Nick Fuentes had a private dinner with Donald Trump. Like, what kind of YouTube persona just has a private dinner with an ex-president? Give me a break.
I mean, it happens. See Charlie Kirk, see Candace Owens, see all those people. I mean, generally what happens first, though, is they get kind of caught up and bought up by think tank money first, get integrated into the system.
Yeah.
And then they get to have all these special meetings and so on.
Yeah, but I thought this was interesting because I was like, Moldbug had to have some support from somewhere, and this seems to be it. All right, Logos, here's the deal. This is long, really long. I think we engage with the chat some, and then we wrap it up.
Sure. I guess we could do that.
I mean, because this would probably take 40 minutes. I'm not joking.
It might. Yeah, that's definitely another long one. My goodness. Yeah, this guy does not know how to write short, does he? It's impossible.
He just rambles all over the place. Well, but we also have a small chat, so okay. I don't know. Maybe I'm going to do my Henry V routine once more into the breach. I guess we have to. If the chat were longer, I would just engage with the chat, but
yep.
We've committed. We'll have to read this article some other day if we don't read it today.
Yep.
The Secret of Anti-Americanism, August 8th, 2007. As a young American living outside the U.S., I often found myself exposed to the odd belief system that is often called anti-Americanism. I had trouble understanding how or why anyone could think this way. Reality, which my father brought home every night in the slim, serious form of the Herald Trib, was one thing, and anti-Americanism quite another. And yet, the creed seemed quite popular. Moreover, it was no peasant superstition. If anything, the local elites, with whose spawn I was, of course, raised, and whose wealth and sophistication were undeniable, tended to be the most anti-American around. If anyone was pro-American, it was the people, farther down the food chain. This was a puzzle, and it was quite some time before I had any satisfying answer to the mystery. American intellectuals today, we see basically two views of anti-Americanism. If you are a progressive intellectual, you probably believe that anti-Americanism is the natural consequence of the notorious crimes committed by America in the past and present. We could call this the death world theory after an old sci-fi novel by Harry Harrison. Again with the sci-fi. Without debating the details of America's rap sheet, the basic problem with the death world theory is that many other 20th century powers committed notorious crimes, the Soviets, the Chinese, and of course the dastardly French, without creating any phenomena ever remotely similar to anti-Americanism. If you are a conservative intellectual, you may believe that anti-Americanism is more or less the modern equivalent of anti-Semitism, that it is a lie propagated by unprincipled politicians for the usual purpose of rising to power on a wave of hate. We could call this the Mustache Man theory of anti-Americanism. Mustache Man was certainly no fan of Jazz Age America, infested as it was by Negroes and Jews. That's actually not true. If you actually read what he said, he considers England and America fellow Nordic nations. So Moldbug whiffs on history on this one. The difficulty with the Mustache Man theory is that most, although not all, of the world's anti-Americanists seem to hate Mustache Man even more than they hate America. So it's a little difficult to imagine them borrowing his tricks. There are certainly bits of truth to both the Death World and Mustache theories, but otherwise they really don't jump out at me and say, yes, I'm an accurate representation of reality, so perhaps it's worth digging deeper. I see 4 really puzzling facts about anti-Americanism. First, the actual content of anti-Americanism is basically nonsense. I guarantee you that if anyone capable of reading this blog got to sit down for an hour and chat with Bush, Cheney, or any other of their henchmen, they would come away with an impression of an enormously likable, intelligent, and utterly sincere individual. Moreover, this impression is quite accurate. My father, a career Foreign Service officer with a PhD in philosophy, met quite a few of these people because of one of the tasks of an FSO is shepherding congressmen on junkets. Regardless of party affiliation, all American politicians are likable, all are fairly, if seldom extremely intelligent, and all are quite sincere in their desire to improve not only America but the world. Why would they be otherwise? Never ascribe to malice what can be adequately explained by incompetence. See, this is interesting here, right? Because I've noticed a theme, and this sort of crystallized it again for me. Moldbug is always going over, he's always bending over backwards to argue that the people in charge, the elites, are actually, really talented, upstanding people. And I'm just like, where is he getting this from? Nothing that I've seen in the last 20 years of American history indicates that. Like they're all unhinged sociopaths. Like, is this just class interest again on Moldbug's part?
It could be class interest. It could be libertarian Kool-Aid. How are the elites the elites? Well, they must have deserved to be in charge. They climbed that competence hierarchy, Todd.
Yeah, the lobsters.
Uh-oh.
The lobsters,
The
boyo.
lobsters.
Second, while it's not unusual for humans to believe nonsensical calumnies, anti-Americanists tend to be the best educated and generally most fashionable and sophisticated people in their countries. It is not unusual for fashionable and sophisticated people to believe nonsense, but they need a strong psychological motivation to do so. Moreover, the obvious motivation, ethnic nationalism, tends to be quite unfashionable among these same elites. Not even French anti-Americanists believe that it's wrong for America to rule the world because France should be ruling it instead. I think if you compare his attempt to explain anti-Americanism, Uncle Ted did a much better job. The left is just a bunch of losers that hate, strength, health, and victory, and that's why they do it. Like, I mean, Uncle Ted just gets right to the point,
Yeah.
What was it? Okay, 3 anti-Americanists do not seem to hate America or Americans. At least that is my experience. Whoa. What the heck, Logos? Everybody hates flyover country. What is he talking about?
Yep.
Though, of course, there are exceptions. Often the line is that the U.S. is the greatest country in the world, or would be if we lived up to its own values.
Okay, now I see what you're saying. That's true.
Yeah, I've heard that, but they really do hate a lot of Americans.
They do, yep.
Or they will tell you that they love American people, but they hate the American government, Bush, etc. Fourth, the world capital of anti-Americanism appears to be America. Certainly, if there is a system of institutions in which anti-Americanism predominates, it's the Western university system. Certainly, the West's most prestigious universities are in America, and certainly anti-Americanism is no hardship to an American academic career. Where does Noam Chomsky teach? Not at the Sorbonne. Here is my explanation for these 4 unusual facts. Your mileage, as usual, may vary. Okay. In light of last article, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut through, what was it, the formal and the real. The real meaning of anti-Americanism is it's a smokescreen that they can use to justify their power. It's like, look, we hate ourselves, we hate what we did in the past, but we're still going to keep all of that wealth and power that we accumulated over the past. We're not going to give that up. Hell no. And so it's a kind of like smokescreen.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting isn't that they say they hate America. It's the way in which they say they hate America. As you pointed out, right? America is bad, but it could be better if. And so what you really pay attention to is the if.
But yeah. First, I believe anti-Americanism is best described as an epiphenomena of universalism. Because of course he does, right, Logos? Because of course he does.
Mm-hmm.
The single most significant fact about the world today is that 62 years ago it was conquered by a military alliance whose leader was the United States and whose creative battle was the non-theistic adaptation of New England mainland Protestantism. I don't think it's a coincidence that the European ruling classes hold essentially the same perspectives that were held in Harvard in 1945. The U.S. Army did not shoot all the professors in Europe and replace them with Yankee carpetbaggers, but their prestige of conquest is such that it might as well have. It makes sense to view anti-Americanism as a post-war phenomenon because it's hard to find anywhere in Europe's pre-war political scene that corresponds to it. But here's the thing, Logos. There was a lot of anti-Americanism in Latin America due to the Mexican-American War, due to the Spanish-American War, and the mucking around in the Caribbean and Central America. So maybe there is something to do with what America does overseas, Logos. What do you think?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really surprised in this whole discussion about anti-Americanism, he actually forgot the most vocal country of all, Iran.
Good point.
Oops. I wonder why Iran's anti-American. I'm sure it has nothing to do with, the Mossadegh coup and, supporting a brutal dictator. Probably not, right, Logos?
Probably not.
Probably not. Okay. But before World War II, a European who found American influence pernicious was most likely a man of the right, generally either an anti-Wilsonian aristocrat or a Bonapartist nationalist demagogue. After the war, and especially since the rise of the post-war educated generation of 1968, European anti-Americanism has been overwhelmingly on the left. Considering the animosity between these factions, it's hard to find any continuity between them. One way to look at the relationship between America and European political creeds is an analogy I often find useful, comparing the transmission of traditions to the transmission of languages. In the 1940s, America invaded Europe rather than the other way around. Therefore, we would expect to see more political diversity in America than in Europe. For much the same reason, there are more dialects of English in Britain than in the United States. The Englishmen who came to the U.S. were by no means uniformly distributed across England, Scotland, and Wales. And the randomizing process of migration tended to homogenize their speech and create a lingua franca, just as the English of Appalachia retains Elizabethan tropes, which have long since disappeared in the home country. The universalism of Europe has a kind of New Deal purity, which the fray of American politics has long since diluted. In Europe, universalism has no significant natural enemies. It flourishes as a kind of colonial hypercolony like the Argentine ant. The sort of right-wing populism one can see every day on Fox News barely exists even in Britain, and the degenerate lowbrow form of the Daily Mail, where it is clearly in the process of vanishing. That didn't age well with the BNP and everything else. The UKIP populism on the right in England came back with a vengeance, didn't it, Logos?
No kidding.
On the continent, it is already extinct for all practical purposes, reappearing only east of the Oder in figures like the Kaczynski twins. But well, what about the Le Pen's, Logos? Let me see. When did Marine Le Pen get started politically? Because I want to see this. Because this could be Moldbug, talking out of his backside again. Okay, Wikipedia says 1986 to 2010, rise within the National Front. So she was active in 2007. How can Moldbug spout this nonsense? Marine Le Pen was for the National Front. And this is what, of course, got really popular later on.
Right.
Whatever. Well, anti-universalist attitudes are socially unfashionable in the United States. They are socially unacceptable in most of Europe. Though already the Swedes are famous for spewing great masses of filthy wrong things when extremely intoxicated. This is how the European Union can claim to be a culmination of democracy while in fact being entirely free from politics. The truth is that for a tiny minority of carping malcontents, all respectable Europeans agree on significant political questions. Europe's educational system has simply done a fantastic job of eradicating dissent. Fine. But what does this all have to do with anti-Americanism? How can any essentially American tradition be anti-American? This still makes no sense. The truth is, in my opinion, that Europeans hate not America but the American government. And they hate not the American government but the Red government, defense, the White House, and maybe quite astonishing these days, the CIA. In other words, they're just like the San Francisco liberal who loves her country but doesn't trust her government. The fact that the overwhelming majority of American government employees work for the blue government simply does not occur to her in this context, nor to the Europeans. The foreign policy institution of the blue government is, of course, the State Department, much as the foreign policy institution of the red government is the Defense Department. So one way to see Europe is as a client of state, much as Israel is a client state of defense. No wonder they hate each other. When Europeans express anti-American sentiments, in my opinion, they're actually acting as a loyal servant of the America that conquered them 6 decades ago. Of course, Europe was invaded by tanks, airplanes, and infantry, not diplomats, educators, and aid workers, but the America that won World War II was a one-party state that had no place for the right. Wait, so America is now a one-party state? I thought it was a democracy, Logos.
Schrodinger's democracy, right, Todd? Schrodinger's democracy. And also FDR. Everybody knew he was in charge, but it wasn't formalism, right? Schrodinger's formalism, Schrodinger's democracy. Like,
I don't get it. And it recreated Europe in its own image. The Cold War between state and defense, eggheads and jocks, blue state and red state broke out only after the shooting had stopped. In fact, one theory is that the Cold War is not just a Cold War, it is the Cold War. Here's another puzzle. Even long after it became clear that the atrocities of communism met and exceeded those of NS, anti-communism remained our conventional wisdom. It has never been even slightly dislodged from its victory over the anti-communists, McCarthyites, and Birchers. There is no hint, of course, of anti-NS. It is interesting to read the classic works of American anti-communism today, like the all-time Bircher bestseller, John Spormer's None Dare Call It Treason, which sold 7 million copies in its day. From the benefit of hindsight, almost all the details in the book are correct. Castro and Mao really were communist SOBs and so on. At this level, it is a grip on reality is far stronger than anything which was taught at Harvard in its time. But the overarching paranoid theory of anti-communism, the idea that all American institutions have been infiltrated by the devious agents in Moscow, strike us as nonsensical today, and rightly so. If you can't afford a copy of None Dare Call It Treason, a bargain at only 1 cent, perhaps, plus shipping, you can see Eric Raymond, who is an ass, but certainly no dummy, promoting this theory as recently as 2005. One thing I'll add, I think with the Birchers, the mistake that they made was they saw all of these foundation institutions and blamed them on the Soviets rather than Ford, Carnegie, and Rockefeller.
Yeah, good point. But then that's been a perennial problem with the conservative movements. Is capitalism good? Stuff done by rich people good, even if the rich people themselves are acting to dismantle the country.
Right. All the stuff that they said was being done. But, you know, again, to quote Moldbug, you can't blame the one party that wasn't there to do anything. And you know, the Soviet Union was a world away, right? So, yeah. What Raymond sees and what the anti-communists saw was the remarkable alignment of universalism with the interests of the KGB. True enough, what they missed was that they'd drawn the tail wagging the dog. It's not that the American left was the tool of Moscow. In fact, it was the other way around. From day one, the Soviet Union was the pet experiment of the benign Penznats. Edward Bellamy's looking backward in Cyrillic. It was a client state to end all client states. Okay, now this would be a perfect time to mention Sutton. He does not, but that doesn't make his statement any less true, because it is. It really was this internationalist cabal that supported the Soviet Union. And I've mentioned elsewhere Sutton, and on Twitter I've told people where they can find his works. So, carrying on. True, the Soviet system never worked properly. Bellamy's industrial army didn't turn out to be as fun as it sounded. And in the end, most Western intellectuals lost any faith that Russia, at least, was the planned society of their dreams. But if you imagine how American libertarians would react if Putin's Russia declared itself a libertarian paradise tomorrow, you may get some idea of how and why the process of disillusionment was so slow and halting. It's not just that the Western intellectuals saw the Soviet experiment as a glimpse of the future. The Soviet Union was a true client state. It depended existentially on the support of its Western patrons, and its demise had much to do with the demise of that support. Again, true. It's moments like this where I do wonder about Moldbug. He'll say something like this, which is absolutely true, embedded in like an ocean of nonsense. Logos.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to do that. The Soviet system was a military tyranny, but it was not just a military tyranny. Its security also depended on a pervasive state religion, and the essence of that religion was the belief that the Soviet Union was at the forefront of human development. The fact that large numbers, often even the majority of Western intellectuals, agreed with this claim was a cornerstone of the Soviet political formula. It was a keystone. Because not even the Soviets could convince their own citizens that Russia was the center of civilization. Not only the dumbest Muzik from Okhotsk would swallow that one. However, the idea that America and Europe had fallen under the domination of fascist plutocrats who oppressed enlightened social thought was not at all hard to believe, whether in Russia or elsewhere. This is why the Soviets made such Herculean efforts to maintain the support of prestigious Western intellectuals such as the Webbs, Lion Feuchtwanger, and Lincoln Steffens, and many others, surpassing Potemkin and the problems of tourism as theater. The theory of Russia as a client state of the American left helps us understand the behavior of the great communist spies of the 1940s, Alger Hiss and Harry Dexter White. Now, of course, from where Moldbug is coming from, he says the American left, but what I would really say is the American capital class. It's the capitalist class that supported the Soviet Union. I mean, Ford is generally considered a right-wing guy, especially because of his what he wrote about the tribe, for example, and his support for Mustache Man. So, but he was really supportive of the Soviet Union too. So there you go. Especially all significant institutions of today's transnational world community. The UN, the IMF, the World Bank were designed by one of these gentlemen whose role in passing American documents to Soviet military intelligence is now beyond dispute. John Stormer was right, or was he? The thing is that while technically Hiss and White were certainly Soviet agents, they hardly fit the profile of a traitor like Aldrich Ames. Hiss and White were at the top of their professions, respected and admired by everyone they knew. What motivation could they possibly have for treason? Why would men like this betray their country? I don't know, Logos. Like, why would the enlightened aristocrats who are just perfect and pure and have climbed the ladder and are the ultimate lobsters, why would they do this?
Because it benefits them, obviously.
I know. I'm being sarcastic. It's just, I'm just tired of this sucking noise that I hear from Moldbug every time he talks about the elites.
Yep. Well, he's a libertarian and he's in their class. I mean, what do we expect?
But then he's not a libertarian. I don't know what this is. The obvious answer, in my opinion, is that they didn't see themselves as betraying their country. The idea that they were Russian tools would never have occurred to them. When you see a dog, a leash, and a man, your interpretation is that man is walking the dog, even if the latter appears to be towing the former. Hiss and White, in my opinion, believed, like many of their social and cultural background, that the United States had nothing to fear from the Soviet Union. They saw themselves as using the Soviets, not the other way around, helping to induce the understandably paranoid Russian leadership to ingratiate themselves into the new global order. Probably they had much the same picture of their actions that Larry Franklin on the other side of the aisle had when he passed documents to Israel. In this theory, the Soviet Union is simply the first and largest of the many third world states which American Universalists establishment played midwife to. From Mao, Castro, Nasser, Ho, down to Mugabe, Khomeini, and Chavez, the fingerprints of the State Department, the Times, and the universities are everywhere. The Bolsheviks are just the first of the series. Again, that's true. Note that not that the Polygon ever had control over these gangsters. No one can control a gangster. The likes of Hiss and White would have lasted 5 minutes in a power struggle with Stalin. And if his name had been Heriberto de Nito and his passport hadn't been blue, Castro would have had Herbert Matthews locked in a dog cage. To these mafia dons of the 20th century, their American intellectual patrons were no more than useful idiots. And their entreaties of foreigners to actually implement freedom and democracy has promised the baying of sheep. And there were easy ways of diffusing even this bang. One way, still in use by Castro, as I write, is to point to the hostility of America, i.e., more exactly of the Red government. If America would only make peace with us, we would become good and sweet and true. But for now, it is necessary to take extreme measures to defend ourselves from the Pentagon and CIA. You know, Logos, it's really interesting. He's leaving out the Muslims in this whole narrative. The people who are being victimized as of 2007 by the U.S. State Department.
Yeah, wait till he hears about Libya.
My gosh. Okay. Thus, devout Universalists could blame all the suffering of the Cold War, not least its numerous hot wars, quite credibly on their own political enemies, rather than on the militarist mafias to which the State Department had helped hand over half the planet. At least Europe did not prove favorable to gang rule, at least not quite as favorable. Anti-Americanism, in this interpretation, is the organizing ideology of an empire. Call it the Blue Empire. The Blue Empire is an American empire, and its headquarters are the Foggy Bottom in Cambridge and Times Square. Anti-Americanists have no idea that they are in fact serving the needs and wishes of the Blue Empire, but then again, why would they? Well, I mean, obviously, because it pays well. Like, why would you even ask that question, Logos?
Yeah.
The Blue Empire's bitter enemy is the Red Empire, whose headquarters is Arlington and, for the moment, Pennsylvania Avenue. The Red Empire is currently defending itself in Israel, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Colombia. Former clients such as Chile, Spain, Portugal, South Vietnam, and South Africa having fallen to the blue side. The Red Empire still has strong clients in Asia, those such as Japan, Taiwan, and Indonesia. Meanwhile, a few countries have actually managed to escape the Blue-Red War and become independent. They have names like Russia, China, and Russia. These places are doing quite well at the moment, and although their continuing success is by no means guaranteed. A nation is genuinely independent of America if its domestic politics are not correlated at all with American domestic politics. Iran and Venezuela, for example, are not independent of America, not only because anti-Americanism is a huge part of their internal political formulas, it plays a much smaller, if not detectable, role in China and Russia. Oh, wait, well, that's a stupid argument, Logos, because in light of what's going on today, that just means China and Russia are American puppets. Does anybody seriously believe that?
Well, look at the definition again. I want to see if I heard that correctly. There it is. Are not correlated at all with American domestic politics. What? Like, everything has some correlation with everything. I mean, examples abound. That's why the whole correlation doesn't equal causation meme is such a thing. Like, there's so many charts you can plot of like correlations between two things that have nothing to do with each other. Like, why is he using correlation for this definition? What the hell?
I don't know. But also because the regimes both exhibit existential dependence on American political forces. Iran needs the American left to defend it from attacks by the American right. What? Like that?
What?
That's not what. Wow, I don't remember that. The woman stoning gay, hanging mullahs of Iran, like other Islamic fundamentalists, don't really strike a chord in their universalist heart, except with a few real misfits like John Walker Lind. But to paraphrase Churchill, in a fight between the Pentagon and Satan himself, San Francisco can be relied upon to side with the latter. Venezuela is not seriously threatened by the U.S. military, except perhaps in its imagination, but Chavez, like the Soviets of yore, basks in the adulation he receives from the likes of Chomsky. One can assume this is a non-trivial aspect of his political formula. And then, of course, there is Palestine, the pearl of the Blue Empire, but hopefully the pattern is clear by now. From a strictly Machiavellian perspective, we have to regard the Blue Empire as a work of genius. It removes every inessential element of imperialism and strips it down to its pure functional necessities. As Saint Exupéry put it, the machine is complete only when there's nothing left to take away. The entire process of decolonization was no more than the transfer of the Third World states from the old European Optimate empires to the Blue Empire. By shifting indirect rule from the regional to the national level, decolonization could define itself as liberation. You know, I love it how in this whole discussion, Logos, the real elephant in the room, you know, global transnational corporations, never really seems to manifest, does it?
Nope.
Gee, you know, Logos, I wonder who backed up the Soviet Union way back in its infancy. Oh, yeah, Morgan Chase Bank.
Yep.
Oh, Oh, we can't talk about that. Those are good boys logos. We can't talk about the banks. In fact, the liberated states were left in the hands of the Blue Empire advisors who offered them aid and planned to use their countries as experiments in universalist nation building and corrupt local thugs. Sometimes the relationship was good, sometimes it was bad. When it was good, the money flowed, and when it was bad, it didn't. In every case, however, nations were not so much built as destroyed, and post-colonialism brought nothing but murder, theft, and decay. However, this was no skin at all off the Blue Empire's back. The purpose of empire is not actually to civilize the natives. Whoa, Logos, did you just say 2 articles ago the purpose of empire was to civilize Africa?
Is that what he said?
Or remember the Rhodesia article?
I don't remember talking much about empire in that article, but I'm not going to lie, my eyes kind of glazed over a little bit because there's a bunch of history stuff that I had no idea about.
Well, okay, do you remember his distinction about civilization? Because we're all civilized now, we can, when we look at the savages, we don't relate to them the same way.
Yeah, that was the Myth of the Noble Savage article. Yeah.
Yeah, but like the point of like Rhodesia, which was at one part a part of the British Empire until it declared independence, was to civilize them. At least I thought that was what came up.
Maybe. I probably missed it.
And certainly when he talked about the fall of the Egyptian nationalists taking power back, he certainly viewed that as a de-civilization force. And so why was that cosmopolitan community in Cairo so good? Because it was civilizing. Because the British Empire was civilizing.
True.
So it's like whatever. Again, there's no way to really figure out Moldbug. Where were we? The purpose of empire. That is 19th century colonialist propaganda. The purpose of empire is to provide political validation for the imperial party back home. The old British and French empires were always money-losing propositions, but greater showpieces and patronage parks for the militarist, aristocratic, conservative parties that sponsored them. Okay, one, he sounds progressive here. That's kind of like sus, right? But second of all, in a technical sense, right, the state, you could say, was losing money from the empire, but certainly not the corporations within France and Britain that were exploiting those resources. I mean, that's absurd. I mean, ultimately, because the thing is, the argument that they were net losses is something that you'll see with regards to the later empire. So at the early 20th century, obviously Elizabeth wouldn't have gone on an empire building campaign if it was a net loss, because you wouldn't do it. This is just stupid. England was a poor country in 1600. They're not going to go on a colonial expedition unless it pays.
Yeah.
But at least they provided some civilization, and at least they didn't lose too much money. The river of money that America and European taxpayers have poured into the Blue Empire has produced a neo-feudal corruption economy throughout Africa. As one Keynesian economist put it, just stop the aid, but so what? Who gives a rat's ass about Africa? Aid makes universalist politicians look caring and statesmanlike, and that's what counts. Well, no, the aid is a bribe, right? You're basically bribing these dictators to not do anything.
Yep.
I think aid to Africa is paying off Attila the Hun. That's more what it is.
Mm-hmm.
No wonder Barack Obama wants to double foreign aid. Somehow I suspect he's thinking of Israel, although the legislative process being what it is, no doubt they will get a taste as well. In a sense, we see the death world theory is exactly right. Anti-Americanism is indeed the result of American foreign policy, but not in quite the way most people imagine. My favorite quote on an American foreign policy is 157 years old. It was originally written about Britain, but I think the transformation is fairly straightforward. The author is the original Dark Prince of Conservatism, Thomas Carlyle, who said in Latter Day pamphlet number 4, and at all times, and even now, there will remain the question to be sincerely put and wisely answered: what essential concern has the British nation with them and their enterprises? Any concern at all except that of handsomely keeping apart from them? If so, what are the methods of best managing it? At present, as was said, while Red Republic but clashes with foul bureaucracy and nations. Sunk in a blind Ingavia, demanded universal suffrage, parliament to hear the wretchedness and wild anarchy and phallus worship struggle with sham kingship and extinct or galvanized Catholicism, and in the cave of the winds all manner of rotten waifs and wrecks are hurled against each other. Our English interest in the controversy, however huge said controversy grow, is quite trifling. We have only in a handsome manner to say it, tumble and rage along ye rotten waifs and wrecks, clash and collide as seems fittest to you, and smite each other into annihilation at your own good pleasure. In that huge conflict, dismal but unavoidable, we, thanks to our heroic ancestors, have got so far ahead of you, have now no interest at all. Our decided notion is the dead ought to bury the dead in such a case, and so we have the honor to be, with distinguished consideration, your entirely devoted Flimnap, Secretary of Foreign Department. I really think Flimnap, till truer times come, ought to treat much of his work in this way, cautious to give offense to his neighbors, resolute not to concern himself in any of their self-annihilating operations whatsoever. If America were to adopt a Carlylean foreign policy, disbanding the Blue Empire, the Red Empire, and all their agents, functionaries, and administrators, I suspect the concept of anti-Americanism would very quickly enter the history books. As for the world, I wouldn't be too surprised if it actually turned out to be able to fend for itself. Of course, this is just a hunch. I could be wrong. I suppose in that case, the deal would have to bury the dead. The deal would have to bury the dead. So, one, it would not enter the history books. Islam would still be very mad. Russia would still be very mad. That's not going to go anyway anytime soon. China would still be very mad. Also, given that empire costs all this money, Logos, the idea that this can be reduced to a kind of political theater is insane. I mean, this is stupid. People build empires for resources. That's like Empire 101.
Yep.
Like, how can we talk about empires and not the acquisition of resources?
Mm-hmm.
If you're not going to talk about economics or resources and just view this as an elaborate political theater, I mean, you're beyond delusional. There's nothing to be said. All right. Wow. Not a lot here in the comments tonight, but there's a few things. Where was it? Ryan Young, do you guys believe democracy has always been so fake and manipulative, or is it just in our lifetimes? The first thing I'll say is we don't live in a democracy. Corporations run everything. I don't know why this is so hard for people to understand. And more to the point, technicians run everything, right? Let's say you have a power plant and it provides power to a city. The actual decisions that are made that affect the city come from this, privately owned corporation, or if it's in the old Soviet Union, it was publicly owned. And then the question is, well, how does that guy, who's running the plant actually get timely information? And, how are the decisions made? They're not made democratically. If the people vote, they don't report directly to him. He gets reports down from the top. But broadly speaking, it's these corporate structures that exist that crowd out. Well, technology itself. You can read Jacques Ellul. He says on Technique that technical processes are undemocratic, and as they perpetuate, democracy recedes. So we don't live in a democracy. So I would just argue that what we have now isn't a democracy. So no, they haven't always been as manipulative or fake, because what we have isn't a democracy. Logos.
Sorry, I missed a little bit of that. Say that again.
Sorry. His question was, do you believe democracy has always been so fake and manipulative, or is it just in our lifetimes? My answer was, we don't live in a democracy. We live in corporate tyranny.
I mean, there's so many different kinds of democracy, right? There's Athenian democracy. There's pre-universal suffrage American democracy. There's there's no one size fits all version of democracy. Basically, my answer is, the easier it is for the average person to vote, the more fake and dumb democracy gets, because a popularity contest is what the average idiot citizen can understand.
Okay.
The more skin in the game that's required to vote to participate, the more you have to know, the more you have to be aware of what's going on around you, the more you have to do service guarantee citizenship or whatever maybe you'd like to use, the more highbrow democracy can be. So, yeah, it's funny because, never mind. Let's just continue.
Yeah. Cyber Ninja Zero, the Middle East is generally anti-American. Yep, I don't know how Moldbug could leave out the Middle East in 2007.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing to say there. One-party democracy. Right. Yeah, so... And here, we don't live in democracies that have been tried. It has been tried. It's called New England, and it worked great for 90 years. I mean, this is just stupid. So, that was prior to American independence. So, yeah. Anything else, Logos?
Nope, I think I'm good.
All right. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.